Alright, everyone. I'm a hair late, but that's alright. I made myself a cup of tea because, sometimes you just need some caffeine in your life. It's very warm. I'm not going to try and drink it for a while now. But, regardless of all that, ooh, hello, angry microphone sound, my favorite. Anyway, last we left off, our young, intrepid hero had discovered that his professor friend had found something called absolute zero, or at least he found some way to contain it. And the police seemed to think that our young hero murdered that man, perhaps over that very secret. However, our hero pointed out that there's no body, therefore there's no crime. Yet. So we pick up with Then I buried my head in my hands. I had called in the police to help find the professor, and they'd only blundered around and asked a lot of stupid questions. The chief had practically accused me of murder, something I knew he couldn't prove, yet he feared he might. Because I had told the chief of the locked doors and unused cars, he'd confined his investigations to the house itself. He interrupted my thoughts.
Mr. Thornton, I'm going back to town. You will remain here with my men. I advise you to get some sleep, as I shall not be able to carry out certain investigations until the morning. One of my men will spend his time searching the house and patrolling the grounds. The other one will stay here with you. He turned away, whispered some instructions to his men, and, followed by one of them, silently left the laboratory. I started to protest, tried to follow him, and the man at the door stopped me. Silently, almost grimly, he indicated a narrow cot at one end of the room. For a moment I hesitated, feeling the man's eyes upon me. Sleep? On my dead, I felt sure he was dead. My dead friend's cot? Sleep in that fearful place? My whole being crawled with horror. I turned again to the man. His features were unyielding. Perhaps this was more third degree. Limp with weakness and weariness, I dragged my lagging feet towards the cot. As long as I live, I shall never forget my awakening. A uniformed figure, the chief, shaking me by the shoulder. Two other uniformed men silently watching. I sat up and gazed about me dazedly. Bright sunlight streamed through the... Bright sunlight streamed through the windows. A stray gleam struck the cage, and I shrank back, trembling. And yet I had slept soundly. Mr. Thornton,
the chief said,
I have serious news for you. I have positive proof your friend is dead.
Good heavens! The exclamation was wrung from me as recollection returned with a rush. Where? You can't have.
Here.
He thrust a bundle of letters into my hands.
You acted so strangely last night, you caused me to suspect you of a serious crime. Also, you overlooked several important points. You got back from a trip only last night.
Last night? Surely it had been years.
You had left instructions to have your mail forwarded.
The level voice went on.
These letters were evidently one day behind you. I picked them up at your rooms this morning. I took the liberty of opening them. Read this one.
He selected it. With trembling fingers, I extracted from the envelope a single written page. I recognized the handwriting as the professor's, and I read with feverish intensity, each single word burning itself into my consciousness. Dear Thornton, I am writing this in anticipation. I will see that it is mailed when my plans are completed. Too late, dear friend, for you to attempt with the best intentions in the world to frustrate them. You will perhaps recall that many years ago, when I gave you my full confidence, I told you that I felt sure of the law of compensation would atone in some measure for my loss. Thornton, old friend, I believe that in more ways than one my hour has arrived. 2 days ago I completed the absolute zero, but even better, a man called here today. Although he didn't recognize me, I saw through the veneer of added years with ease. Fate, call it what you will, my visitor is a man who wrecked my happiness. Under pretext, I shall detain him. I shall induce him to enter the crystalline cage. I have already arranged a dual control from which the power which the power will destroy when I apply it from the inside of the cage. Please destroy the cage. It'll have brought compensation to me before you read this. Goodbye, dear friend. Roxton.
I apologize, Mr. Thornton.
The chief offered a hand, which I clutched in mingled sorrow and relief. The world had lost a genius, and I had lost a dear friend. But he was right. It was compensation. And that's the end of the Absolute Zero story. If you missed the first portion of that, the first most of it, I should say, well, there is a archive up on my YouTube channel. It's called Glacier Nestor. If you want to drop by, give it a listen. If the end of that story seemed like it was interesting to you, go right ahead. But first, stay tuned, because now we move on to our next story, Tanks, by Murray Leinster. The persistent, oily smell of fog gas was everywhere, even in the little pillbox. Outside, all the world was blotted out by the thick gray mist that went rolling slowly across the country with the breeze. The noises that came through it were curiously muted. Fog gas does mute all noises, at least somewhat, but somewhere to the right, the artillery was pounding something with HE shell, and there were those little spitting undercurrent explosions that told of tanks in action. To the right, there was a distant rolling of machine gun fire. In between was an utter solemn silence. Sergeant Coffey, disreputable to look at and disrespectful of Bien, was sprawling over one of the gunner's seats and talking into a field telephone while mud dripped from him. Corporal Wallace, equally muddy and still more disreputable, was painstakingly manufacturing one complete cigarette from the pinched-out butts of 4 others. Both were rifle infantry. Neither had any right or reason to be occupying a definitely machine gun section post. The fact that the machine gun crew were all dead didn't seem to make much difference to Sector HQ at the other end of the telephone wire, judging from the questions that were being asked. "Why, I tell you," drawled Sergeant Coffey, "they're dead. Yeah, all dead. Just as dead as when I told you the first time, maybe even deader. There's the gas, of course. I don't know what kind. Yeah, they got their masks on." He waited, looking speculatively at the cigarette Corporal Wallace had in manufacture. It began to look imposing, and Corporal Wallace regarded it affectionately. Sergeant Coffey put his hand over the mouthpiece and looked intently at his companion. "Give me a drag of that, Pete," he suggested. "I'll slip you some butts in a minute." Corporal Wallace nodded and proceeded to light the cigarette with infinite artistry. He puffed delicately upon it, inhaled it with the care a man learns when he's had so much tobacco and never expects to get any more, and reluctantly handed it to Sergeant Coffey. Sergeant Coffey emptied his lungs in a sigh of anticipation. He put the cigarette to his lips, and it burned brightly as he drew upon it. Its tip became brighter and brighter until it was white hot, and the paper crackled as the line of fire leapt up the tube. "Hey," said Corporal Wallace in alarm. Sergeant Coffey waved him aside, and his chest expanded to the fullest limit of his blouse. When his lungs could hold no more, he ceased to draw, grandly returned about 1/4 of the cigarette to Corporal Wallace, and blew out a cloud of smoke in small driblets until he had to gasp for breath. "When you ain't got that much time," said Sergeant Coffey amiably, "that's a quick smoke." Corporal Wallace regarded the ruins of his cigarette with a woeful air. "Ah, hell," said Corporal Wallace gloomily, but he smoked what was left. "Yeah," said Sergeant Coffey suddenly into the field telephone. "I'm still here, and they're still dead. Listen, Mr. Officer, I got me a black eye and numerous contusions. Also, my gas mask is busted. Called you up to do you a favor. I aim to head for distant parts. Ain't there anybody else in the Army?" He stopped, and resentment died out in his wide-eyed amazement. Yeah, I got you, Luke. All right, I'll see what I can do. Yeah, but should see my insurance gets paid. Yeah." He hung up gloomily and turned to Corporal Wallace. "We gotta be heroes," he announced bitterly. "Sit out here in the stinking fog, wait for a tank to come along and wipe us out. We're the only listening post within 2 miles of the front. That new gas of theirs wiped out all the rest of them without a report." He surveyed the crumpled figures, which had been the original occupants of the pillbox. They wore the same uniform as himself, and when he took the gas mask off one of them, the man's face was strangely peaceful. "Hell of a war," said Sergeant Coffee bitterly. "Here our gang gets wiped out by a helicopter. I ain't seen sunlight in a week, and I got 4 butts left. Lucky I started saving them." He rummaged shrewdly. "This guy's got half a sack of Makins. Say, that was Luton Madison on the line then. Transferred from our gang to a couple... transferred from our gang a couple months back. They cut him in the line to listen in on me, make sure I was who I said I was. He recognized my voice." Corporal Wallace, after smoking to the last and ultimate puff, pinched out a cigarette and put the fragments of the butt back in his pocket. "What do we gotta do?" he asked, watching as Sergeant Coffee divided the treasure trove into 2 scrupulously exact portions. "Nothing," said Coffee bitterly, "except find out how this gang got wiped out and a few little things like that. Half the front line's in the air, planes can't see anything, and nobody dares to cut the fog gas to look." He didn't say much, but he did say, "Find out something." Corporal Wallace gloated over 1/4 of a sack of tobacco and stowed it away. "The infantry always gets the dirty end of the stick," he said gloomily. "I'm going to roll me a whole one, pre-war, and smoke it presently." "Hell yes," said Coffee. He examined his gas mask from force of habit before stepping out of the fog once more, then contemptuously threw it aside. "Gas masks? Hell, ain't worth having. Come on." Corporal Wallace followed as he emerged from the little round cone of the pillbox. The gray mist that was the fog gas hung over everything. There was a definite breeze blowing, but the mist was so dense it didn't seem to move. It was far enough from the fog flares for the least trace of the striation to have vanished. 15 miles to the north, the fog flares were placed, ranged by hundreds and by thousands, burning one after another as the fog service set them off, and sending out their incredible masses of thick gray vapor, in long threads that spread out before the wind, coalesced, and made a smokescreen to which the puny efforts of the last war, the war that was to make the world safe for democracy, were as nothing. Here, 15 miles downwind from the flares, it was possible to see clearly, if only in a circle approximately 5 feet in diameter. At the edge of that circle, outlines began to blur, and at 10 feet, all shapes were the faintest of bulks and the dimmest of outlines. At 15 feet, all was invisible, hidden behind a screen of mist. "Cast around," said Coffee gloomily. "Maybe we'll find a shell or the tracks of a tank or something that chucked the gas here." It was rather ludicrous to go searching for anything in that mass of vapor. At 3 yards distance, they could make out each other at dim outlines, but no more. It didn't even occur to them to deplore the mist. The war, which had already been christened by politicians at home, the last war, was always fought in the mist. Infantry couldn't stand against tanks. Tanks couldn't live under aircraft-directed artillery fire. Not when 40 guns fired salvos for the aircraft to spot. And neither artillery nor aircraft could take any advantage of a victory which, either under special conditions, might win. The general staffs of both the United States and the prominent nation, let us say the Yellow Empire, at war with it, had come to a single conclusion. Tanks or infantry were needed for the use of victories. Infantry could be destroyed by tanks, but tanks could be hidden from aerial spotters by smoke screens. The result was the fog gas, which was being used by both sides in the most modern fashion when their own unit wiped out and themselves wandering aimlessly in the general direction of the American rear. Sergeant Coffee and Corporal Wallace stumbled upon an American pillbox with its small garrison lying dead. For 40 miles in one direction, perhaps 30 in the other, the vapor lay upon the earth. It was being blown by the wind, of course, but it was sufficiently heavier than air to cling to the ground level, and the industries of 2 nations were straining every nerve to supply the demands of their respective armies for its material. The fog bank was nowhere less than 100 feet thick, a cloud of impalpable particles, impenetrable to any eye or camera, however shrewdly filtered. And under that mattress of pale opacity, the tanks crawled heavily. They lurched and rumbled upon their deadly errands, uncouth and barbarous, listening for each other by a myriad of devices, locked in desperate, short-range conflict when they came upon each other, and emitting clouds of deadly vapor, against which gas masks were no protection, when they came upon opposing infantry. Wish me luck. I'm gonna try and drink this tea. I'm pretty sure it's too warm, though. Oh no, much too warm. Never mind. Rather not burn my mouth alive on air. Might not be a good idea. The infantrymen, though, were few. Their principal purpose was the reporting of the approach or passage of tanks, and trenches were of no service to them. They occupied unarmed little listening posts with field telephones, small wireless or ground buzzer sets for reporting the enemy before he overwhelmed them. Excuse me. They held small pillboxes fitted with anti-tank guns which sometimes, if rarely, managed to get home a shell, aimed largely by sound, before the tank rolled over gun and gunners alike. And now Sergeant Coffey and Corporal Wallace groped about in that blinding mist. There had been 2 little systems of listening posts hidden in it, each of them admittedly of little fighting value, but they were each 1 deep and composed of an infinity of little pinpoint posts where 2 or 3 men were stationed. The American posts, by their reports, had assured the command that all enemy tanks were on the other side of a certain definite line. Their own tanks, receiving recognition signals, passed and repassed along them, prowling in quest of invaders. The enemy tanks crawled upon the same grisly patrol on their own side. But 2 miles of the American front had suddenly gone silent. 100 telephones had ceased to make reports along the line nearest the enemy. As Coffey and Wallace stumbled about the pillbox, looking for some inkling of the way in which the original occupants of the small strong point had been wiped out, the second line of observation posts began to go dead. Now one, now another, abruptly ceased to communicate. Half a dozen were in actual conversation with their sector headquarters and broke off between words. The wires remained intact, mind you, but in 15 nerve-wracking minutes, a second 100 posts ceased to make reports and ceased to answer the inquiry signal. GHQ was demanding explanations in crisp accents that told the matter was being taken very seriously indeed. And then, as the officer in command of the second line sector headquarters, sorry about that spoonerism, was explaining frenziedly that he was doing all any man could do, he stopped short between 2 words, and thereafter he, also, ceased to communicate. Frontline sector headquarters seemed inexplicably to have escaped whatever fate had overtaken all its posts, but it could only report that they had apparently gone out of existence without warning. American tanks prowling in the area that had gone dead announced no enemy tanks had been seen. G-81, stumbling on a pillbox no more than 10 minutes after it had gone silent, offered to investigate. A member of her crew in a gas mask stepped out of the port doorway, and immediately thereafter, G-81's wireless reports stopped coming in. The situation was clearly shown in the huge tank that had been built to serve as GHQ. That tank was 70 feet long and lay hidden in the mist with a brood of other smaller tanks clustered near it, from each of which a cable ran to the telephones and instruments of the greater monster. Farther off in the fog, of course, were other tanks, hundreds of them, fighting machines all, silent and motionless now, but infinitely ready to protect the brain of the army. The GHQ maneuver board showed the battle as no single observer could have ever seen it. A map lay spread out on a monster board under a pitiless white light. It was a map of the whole battlefield. Tiny sparks crawled here and there under the map, and there were hundreds of little pins with different colored heads to mark the position of this thing and that. The crawling marks were the reported positions of American tanks, made visible as positions of moving trains that had been visible for years on the electric charts of railroads and dispatchers' offices. Where the tiny bulbs glowed under the map, there a tank crawled into the fog, and as the tank moved, the first bulb went out and another flashed into light. The general watched broodingly as the crawling sparks moved from this place to that place, as variable colored lights flashed up and vanished, a steady hand reaching down to shift tiny pins and place new ones. The general moved rarely and spoke hardly at all. His whole air was that of a man absorbed in a game of chess, a game on which the fate of a nation depended. He was thus absorbed. The great board, illuminated from above by the glaring bulb, and speckled with little white sparks from below by tiny bulbs beneath, showed the situation clearly at every instant. The crawling white sparks were his own tanks, each in its present position. Flashing blue sparks noted the last report of the enemy tank. 2 staff officers stood behind the general, and each spoke from time to time into a strapped-on telephone transmitter. They were giving routine orders, heading the nearest American patrol tanks toward the location of their latest reported enemies. The general reached out his hand suddenly and marked off an area with his fingers. They were long fingers and slender ones, and artist's fingers.
Our outposts are dead in this space,
he observed meditatively. The use of the word outpost dated him many years back as a soldier, back to the old days of open warfare, which had only now come about again.
Penetration of 2 miles.
Tank, sir, said the man of the steady fingers, putting a black pin in this position within that area. Let out a man in a gas mask to examine a pillbox. The tank doesn't report a reply, sir.
Gas,
said the general, noting the spot.
They're new gas, of course. It must go through masks or sag paste, or perhaps both.
He looked up to a row of officers seated opposite him, each man with headphones strapped to his ears and a transmitter before his lips, and each man with a map pad on his knees, from which from time to time they made notations and shifted pins absorbedly.
Captain Harvey,
said the general,
are you sure that the dead spot has not been bombarded with gas shells?
Yes, General. There's been no artillery fire heavy enough to put more than a fraction of those posts out of action, and all that fire, sir, has been accounted for elsewhere. The officer looked up. Saw the general's eyes shift, and bent to his map again, on which he was marking areas from which spotting aircraft reported flashes as of heavy guns beneath the mist.
Their aircraft could not have been dropping bombs, positively?
A second officer glanced up from his own map. Our planes cover all that space, sir, and for some time, for that matter.
They either have a noiseless tank,
observed the general meditatively,
or...
The steady fingers placed a red pin at a certain spot. One observation post, sir, has reopened communication. 2 infantrymen, separated from their command, came upon it and found the machine gun crew dead, with gas masks adjusted. No tanks or tracks. They're identified, sir, and are now looking for tank tracks or shells. The general nodded emotionlessly.
Let me know immediately.
You must excuse me if I get a little yawny. Kind of forgot to sleep last night working on work. Hence the cup of tea. Still a little warm. Anyway, he fell back to the ceaseless study of the board with its crawling sparks and sudden flashes of light. Over at the left, there were 4 white sparks crawling toward a spot where a blue flash had glowed a little while ago. A red light glowed suddenly where one of the white sparks crawled. One of the 2 officers behind the general spoke crisply. Instantly, it seemed, the other 3 white sparks changed their direction of movement. They swung toward the red flash, the point where a wireless from the tank, represented by the first white flash, had been reported. Contact with the enemy. Enemy tank destroyed here, sir, said the voice above the steady fingers.
Wiped out 3 of our observation posts, murmured the general. His side knows it. There's an opportunity. Have those posts reoccupied.
Orders given, sir, said a staff officer from behind. No reports as yet. The general's eyes went back to the space 2 miles wide and 2 miles deep, in which there was only a single observation post functioning, and that in charge of 2 straight infantrymen. The battle in the fog was in a formative stage now, and the general himself had to watch the whole, because it was by small and trivial indications that the enemy's plans would be disclosed. The dead area, however, was no triviality. Half a dozen tanks were crawling through it, reporting monotonously that no sign of the enemy could be found. One of the little sparks representing those tanks abruptly went out. Tank here, sir, no longer reports. The general watched with lackluster eyes, his mind withdrawn in thought.
Send 4 helicopters,
He said slowly.
to sweep that space. We'll see what the enemy does.
One of the seated officers opposite him spoke swiftly. Far away, a roaring set up and was stilled. The helicopters were taking off. They would rush across the blanket of fog, their vertical propellers sending blasts of air straight downward. For most of their sweep, they would keep a good height, but above the questionable ground, they would swoop down to barely above the fog blanket. There, their monstrous screws would blow holes in the fog until the ground below was visible. If any tanks crawled in there, in the spaces the helicopters swept clear, they'd be visible at once and would be shelled by batteries miles away. Batteries invisible under the artificial cloud bank. No other noises came through the walls of the monster tank. There was a faint, monotonous murmur of the electric generator. There were quiet, crisp orders of the officers behind the general, giving the routine commands that kept the fighting a stalemate. The aircraft officer lifted his head, pressing his headphones tightly against his ears, as if to hear more clearly. The enemy, sir, has sent 60 fighting machines to attack our helicopters. We sent 40 single-seaters as escort.
Let them fight enough,
said the general absently,
to cause the enemy think us desperate for information, then draw them off.
There was silence again. The steady fingers put pins here and there. An enemy tank destroyed here. An American tank encountered an enemy and ceased to report further. The enemy sent 4 helicopters in a wide sweep behind the American lines, escorted by 50 fighting planes. They uncovered a squadron of 4 tanks, which scattered like insects disturbed by the overturning of a stone. Instantly, after their disclosure, 150 guns 4 miles away were pouring shells about the place where they had been seen, and 2 of the tanks ceased to report. The general's attention was called to a telephone instrument with its call light glowing.
Ah,
said the general absently.
They want publicity matter.
The telephone was connected to the rear, and from there to the capital. A much worried cabinet waited for news, and arrangements were made and had been used to broadcast suitably arranged reports from the front, the voice of the commander-in-chief in the field going to every workshop, every gathering place, and even being bellowed by loudspeakers in the city streets. The general took the phone. The President of the United States was at the other end of the wire this time.
General? Still in the preliminary stage, sir,
said the general without haste.
The enemy is preparing a breakthrough effort, probably aimed at our machine shops and supplies. Of course, if he gets them, we'll have to retreat. An hour ago, he paralyzed our radios, not being aware, I suppose, of our tuned earth induction wireless sets. I dare say he's puzzled that our communications haven't fallen to pieces. But what are our chances? The voice of the president was steady, but it was strained. His tanks outnumber ours 2 to 1, of course, sir, said the general calmly. Unless we can divide his fleet and destroy a part of it, of course we'll be crushed in a general combat. But we're naturally trying to make sure that any such action will take place within point-blank range of our artillery, which may help a little. We're trying to cut the fog to secure that help, risking everything if a general engagement occurs.
There was silence. The president's voice, when it came, was more strained still. Will you speak to the public, General?
3 sentences. I have no time for more.
There were little clickings on the line, while the general's eyes returned to the board that was the battlefield in miniature. He indicated a spot with his fingers.
Concentrate our reserve tanks here. Our fighting aircraft at here,
he said meditatively.
At once.
The 2 spots were at nearly opposite ends of the battlefield. The chief of staff, checking the general's judgment with alert suspicion that was the latest addition to his duties, protested sharply. But, sir, our tanks will have no protection against helicopters.
I'm quite aware of it,
said the general mildly. He turned to the transmitter. A thin voice had just announced at the other end of the wire,
"The Commander-in-Chief of the Army will make a statement."
Sorry. The general spoke unhurriedly.
We are in contact with the enemy and have been for some hours. We've lost 40 tanks and the enemy, we think, has lost 60 or more. No general engagement has yet taken place, but we think decisive action on the enemy's part will be attempted within 2 hours. The tanks in the field need now, as always, ammunition, spare tanks, and the special supplies for modern warfare. In particular, we require ever-increasing quantities of fog gas. I appeal to your patriotism for the reinforcements of material and men.
He hung up the receiver and returned to his survey of the board. Those three listening
posts,
he said abruptly, indicating a place near where an enemy tank had been destroyed.
Have they been reoccupied?
Yes, sir. Just reported. The tank they reported rolled over them, destroying the placement. They're digging back in.
Tell me,
said the general,
when they cease to report again, as they will.
He watched the board, and without lifting his eyes from it, he spoke.
That listening post in the dead sector, with the 2 straight infantrymen in it, was it reported?
Not sure. Sir, I'm not sure, but I don't think it has reported yet.
Tell me immediately when it does.
The general leaned back in his chair and deliberately relaxed. He lighted a cigar and puffed at it, his hands quite steady. Other officers, scenting the smoke, glanced up enviously, but the general was the only man who might smoke. The enemy's gases, like the ones, could go through any gas mask in sufficient concentration. The tanks were sealed like so many submarines and opened their interiors to the outer air only after that air had been thoroughly tested and proven safe. Only the general might use up more than a man's allowance for breathing. The general gazed about him, letting his mind rest from its intense strain against the greater strain that would come onto it in a few minutes. He looked at a tall blond man who was surveying the board intently, moving away and returning again, his forehead creased in thought. Excuse me. The general smiled quizzically. That man was the officer appointed to II duty, interpretive intelligence, chosen from 1,000 officers because the most exhaustive psychological test had proven that his brain worked as nearly as possible like that of the enemy commander. His task was to take the place of the enemy commander, to reconstruct from enemy movements reported, and the enemy movements known as nearly as possible, the enemy's plans.
Well, Harlan,
said the general,
where will he strike?
He's tricky, sir, said Harlan. That gap in our listening post looks, of course, like preparation for the massing of his tanks outside our lines. Rather, inside our lines. And it would be logical that he fought off our helicopters to keep them from discovering his tanks massing in that area. The general nodded.
Quite true, quite true.
But, said Harlan eagerly, he'd know we could figure that out, and he may have wiped out a listening post to make us think he was planning to do just so. He may have fought off our helicopters, not to keep them from discovering his tanks in there, but to keep them from discovering there were no tanks in there.
My own idea exactly,
said the general, meditatively.
But again, it looks so much like a feint that it may be a serious blow. I dare not risk assuming it to be a feint only.
He turned back to the board.
Have those two strayed infantrymen reported yet?
He asked sharply. Not yet, sir. The general drummed at the table. There were 4 red flashes glowing at different points of the board. 4 points where American tanks or groups of tanks were locked in conflict with the enemy. Somewhere off in the enveloping fog that made all the world a gray chaos, lumbering, crawling monsters rammed and battered at each other at infinitely short range. They fought blindly, their guns swinging menacingly and belching lurid flames into the semi-darkness, while from all about them dropped the liquids that meant death to any man who breathed their vapor. Those gases penetrated any gas mask and would even strike through the sag paste that had made the vesiatory gases of the 1918 futile. With tanks by the thousands hidden in the fog, 4 small combatants were set up, and 4 only. Battles fought with tanks as the main arm are necessary battles of movement, more nearly akin to cavalry battles than any other, unless it be fleet actions. When the main bodies come into contact, the issue is decided quickly. There can be no long drawn-out stalemates, such as infantry trenches, produced in years past. Fighting that had taken place so far, both under the fog and aloft in the air, was outpost skirmishing only. When would the main body of the enemy come into action? Would it be like a whirlwind? Would the battle be won, or would it be lost in a matter of minutes? The general paid no attention to these 4 conflicts for their possible meaning.
I want to hear from those 2 strayed infantrymen,
he said quietly.
I must base my orders on what they report.
The whole battle, I believe, hinges on what they have to say. He fell silent, watching the board without the tense preoccupation he'd shown before. He knew the moves he had to make in any of the 3 eventualities. He watched the board to make sure he wouldn't have to keep those movies before he was ready. His whole air was that of wanting the commander-in-chief of the Army of the United States, waiting to hear what he would be told by 2 straight infantrymen who were lost in time and fog that covered a battlefield. You must excuse me, just had to have some tea. The fog was neither more dense nor any lighter, where Corporal Wallace paused to roll his pre-war cigarette. The tobacco came from the gassed war machine gunner in the pillbox a few yards off. Sergeant Coffey, 3 yards distant, was a blurred figure. Corporal Wallace put his cigarette into his mouth, struck the match, and puffed delicately. "Huh," said Corporal Wallace, and cheered considerably. He thought he saw Sergeant Coffey moving toward him and ungenerously hid his cigarette's glow. Overhead, a machine gun suddenly burst into a rattling roar, the sound sweeping above them with incredible speed. Another gun answered it. Abruptly, the whole sky above them was an inferno of such tearing noises, and immediately after they began a multitudinous bellowing set up. Airplanes on patrol ordinarily kept their engines muffled in hopes of locating a tank below them by its noise. But in actual fighting, there was too much power to be gained by cutting out the muffler, for any minor motive to take effect. 100 aircraft were above the heads of my 2 strayed infantrymen, and they were fighting madly about 5 helicopters. 200 yards away, one fell to the earth with a crash, and immediately afterward there was a hollow boom. For an instant, even the mist was tinged with yellow from the exploded gasoline tank. The roaring above us continued. Not mounting as in a battle where there's between opposing patrols of fighting planes, where each side find its height. Oh, jeez, I'm all out of sorts today. Jeez, where was I? Not mounting as in a battle between opposing patrols of fighting planes, when each side finds height to a decisive advantage, but keeping nearly to the same level, little above the bank of cloud. Something came down, roaring, and struck the earth no more than 50 yards away. The impact was terrific, but after there was dead silence. Sergeant Coffee came leaping to Corporal Willis's side. "Helicopters?" he barked. "Hunting tanks and pillboxes, lie down." He flung himself down to the earth. Wind beat on them suddenly, then an outrageous blast of ice and icy air came from above. For an instant the sky lightened, saw a hole in the mist, saw the little pillbox clearly, saw a huge framework of supporting screws sweeping swiftly. That's a good tongue twister. Supporting screws sweeping swiftly. Maybe not. Overhead, with figures in it watching the ground through wind-angle glasses, and the machine gunners were frowning madly at the dancing things in the air. Then it was gone. "What ours?" shouted Coffee in Wallace's ears. "They're trying to find the yellow's tanks." Oh, if you must excuse me, I'm going to put a bumper on while I go walk to try and get some energy in.
Hey everyone, I'm Shelby Stager, a senior here at St. Ambrose University, studying both radio, TV production, and journalism. Attending St. Ambrose has been one of the best choices I have made to this day. Not only am I a student at SAU, I am a student athlete. Basketball and academics have taught me awesome time management skills. Here at St. Ambrose, I have been given the experiences that will soon guide me to live out my dream. Freshman year, I was given the opportunity to help with basketball and volleyball broadcasts. In a blink of an eye, I was anchoring the Dateline SAU newscast. My dream of being in front of the camera has soon become a reality. Before coming to SAU, I never once thought I would hear my own voice on the radio, but now I have my own radio show called The Shelby Show. I have been given the privilege to be a KALA Senior Scholarship Intern my senior year. My passionate professors have taught me all the skills I need to have when entering the TV and radio world. I would not be living out my dream today if it weren't for the successful communications department at SAU. My dreams are coming true, and your future will be bright at St. Ambrose University.
All right. Let's hope I can actually have some energy. I could just feel my, how should I say this, performance, just flagging a little. And that's not what I want. I don't want to bore you guys, although admittedly this last story needs to pick it up quite a bit to be on the same level as the rest of the ones we've been reading. But anyway, let's continue and see if it actually picks up. Where did we leave off? The center of the roaring seemed to shift, perhaps to the north. Then a roaring drowned out all the other roarings. This one was lower down and approaching in a rush. Something swooped from the south, a dark blotch in the lighter mist above. Oh, excuse me. It was an airplane flying in the mist. And it appeared and it was gone. and there was a terrific crash. A shattering roar drowned out even the droning tumult of 100 aircraft engines. A sheet of flame flashed up, and then a thunderous detonation followed. "It hit a tree," panted Coffee, scrambling to his feet again. "It was Suicide Club aiming for our helicopter." Corporal Wallace was pointing, his lips drawn back in a snarl. "You shut up," he whispered. "I saw a shadow against that flash. There's a yellow infantryman. Let's get him." "You're crazy," said Sergeant Coffee, but he strained his eyes, and more especially his ears. It was Coffee who clutched Corporal Wallace's wrists and pointed. Wallace couldn't see anything, but as he followed, Coffee moved silently through the gray mist. Presently he too, straining his eyes, saw an indistinct movement. The roaring of motors died away suddenly. The fighting had stopped a long way off, apparently because the helicopters had been withdrawn. Except for the booming of artillery a very long distance away, firing unseen at an unseen target, there was no noise at all. "They're aiming for our pillbox," whispered Coffee. They saw the dim shape moving noiselessly halt. The dim figure seemed to be casting about for something. Then it went down on hands and knees and crawled forward. The two infantrymen crept after it. It stopped and turned around, and the two dodged to one side in haste. The enemy infantrymen crawled off in another direction, the two Americans following him as closely as they dared. He halted once more, a dim and grotesque figure in the fog. They saw him fumbling in his belt. He threw something suddenly. There was a little tap, as if a fountain pen dropped upon concrete. Hold on, is there a pen? There's not a pen. I was going to drop a pen onto the desk, but I suppose I could just do a little, there we go. Foley, everyone. Then a hissing sound. That was all, but the enemy infantryman waited, as if he was listening for something. The two Americans fell upon him as one individual. They bore him to the earth, and Coffee dragged at his gas mask, good tactics in a battle where every man carries gas grenades. He gasped and fought desperately in a seeming frenzy of terror. They squatted over him finally, having taken away his automatics, and Coffee worked painstakingly to get off his gas mask, while Wallace went poking about in a quest of tobacco. Doggone, said Coffee. "This mask is intricate." "He ain't got any pockets," mourned Wallace. Then they examined him more closely. It's a whole suit," explained Coffee. He doesn't have to bother with sag paste. He got him on a land diving suit." Say, gasped the prisoner, his language utterly quickly, in spite of the beady eyes and coarse black hair that marked him as the enemy. "Say, don't take off my mask. Don't take off my mask." "He talks and everything," observed Coffee in mild amazement. He inspected the mask again and painstakingly smashed the goggles. "Now, big boy, you're going to take your chance with the rest of us. What are you doing around here?" The prisoner set his teeth, though deathly pale, and didn't reply. Said Coffee meditatively. "Let's take him in the pillbox and let Lieutenant Madison tell us what to do with him." They picked him up. No, for God's sake, no," cried the prisoner shrilly. "I just guessed it." The two halted, and Coffee scratched his nose. "Reckon he's lying, Pete?" Corporal Wallace shrugged gloomily. "He ain't got no tobacco," he said morosely. "Let's chuck him in first and see." The prisoner wriggled until Coffee put his own automatic in the small of his back. "How long does that gas last?" he asked, frowning. "Lieutenant Madison wants us to report. There's some fellers in there, all gassed up. We were in there a while back. Didn't hurt us. How long does it last?" 15 minutes. Maybe 20. Don't put me in there." Coffee scratched his nose again and looked at his wristwatch. All right, he conceded. "We'll give you 20 minutes. Then we chuck you inside. That is, if you act real agreeable till then. You got anything to smoke?" The prisoner agonizedly opened a zipper slip in his costume and brought out tobacco, even tailor-made cigarettes. Coffee pounced on him 1 second before Wallace, and then divided them with absorbed and scrupulous fairness. "Right," said Sergeant Coffee comfortably. He lighted up. "Say, if you want to smoke, here's one of your pills. Let's see the gas stuff. How do you use it?" Wallace had strapped off a heavy belt about the prisoner's waist, and it was trailing over his arm. He inspected it now. There were 20 or 30 little sticks in it, each one barely larger than a lead pencil, of a dirty gray color, and each one securely nested in a tube of flannel-lined paper mache. These things? Asked Wallace contentedly. He was inhaling deeply with that luxurious enjoyment a tailor-made cigarette can give a man who had been remaking butts into smokes for days past. Don't touch them, warned the prisoner nervously. You broke my goggles. If you throw them, they light and catch fire, and that scatters the gas. Coffee touched the prisoner, indicating the ground, and sat down, comfortably smoking one of the prisoner's cigarettes. By his air, he began to approve of his captive. Say, you talk English pretty good. How'd you learn it? I was a waiter, the prisoner explained. New York, corner 48th and 6th. My God. I used to be a movie operator along there, 49th, projection room stuff. You say, Heen's place? Well, sure. I used to buy scotch from that blonde feller in the back room with a benzene label for a prescription. Coffee lay back and slapped his knee. Ain't it a small world? Pete, he ain't never been in any town. Pete here, he ain't even ever been in any town bigger than Chicago. Ever in Chicago? Well, said Wallace, morose yet comfortable with his tailor-made cigarette, if you guys want to start an extra war, go to knock in Chicago, that's all. Coffee looked at his wristwatch yet again. You got 10 minutes yet? Say, you must know Pete Hanfrey. Well, sure I know him, said the prisoner scornfully. I waited on him one day just before the reserves got called back home, actually. In the monster tank that was headquarters, the general tapped his fingers on his knees. The pale white light flickered a little as it shone on the board where the bright sparks crawled. White sparks were American tanks. Blue flashes were for enemy tanks sighted and reported, usually in the 3-second interval between their identification and the annihilation of the observation post that observed them. Red glows showed encountered between American and enemy tanks. There were a dozen red glows visible, with 1 to a dozen white sparks hovering about them. It seemed as if the whole front line were about to burst into a glare of red, were it about to become one long lane of conflicts in an impenetrable obscurity, where metal monsters roared and rumbled and clanked one against the other, bellowing and belching flame and ramming each other savagely, while from them dripped the liquids that made their breath mean death. There were nightmarish conflicts in the progress under the blanket of the fog, unparalleled save perhaps the undersea battles between submarines in the previous European war. That's really good tea. If I may digress for a moment, the tea I'm drinking is from a monthly box that I subscribe to, and it's just a really simple black tea is one of them from this month. And usually they're really like over the top extravagant flavors that you couldn't have every day, but they just went for a really simple black tea this time. I think there's something special about it, or they wouldn't have put it in the box, but it's just a really simple black tea and I like it. But I digress. Let's return to our war story and hope it gets better. The chief of staff looked up, his face drawn. General, he said harshly, it looks like a frontal attack all along our line. The general's cigar had gone out. He was pale, but calm with an iron composure.
Yes, he conceded, but you forget that blank spot in our line. We don't know what's happening there.
I'm not forgetting it, but the enemy outnumbers us 2 to 1.
I'm waiting, said the general, to hear from those 2 infantrymen who reported some time ago from a listen post in the dead area.
The chief of staff pointed to the outline formed by the red glows where tanks were battling. "Those fights are keeping up too long," he said sharply. "General, don't you see? They're driving back our line, but they aren't driving it back as fast as if they were throwing their whole weight on it. If they were making a frontal attack there, they'd wipe out the tanks we have facing them and they'd roll right over them. That's a feint. They're concentrating in the dead space."
I am waiting,
said the general softly,
to hear from those 2 infantrymen.
He looked at the board again and said quietly,
Have the call signal sent them? They may answer.
He struck a match to relight his dead cigar. His fingers barely quivered as they held the match. It might have been excitement, but it could have been foreboding, too.
By the way,
he said, holding the match clear,
have our machine shops and supply tanks ready to move. Every plane is, of course, ready to take to the air on signal, but get the aircraft ground personnel and their traveling tanks immediately.
Voices began to murmur orders as the general puffed. He watched the board steadily.
Let me know if anything was heard from those infantrymen.
There was a definite air of strain within the tank that was headquarters. It was a sort of tensity that seemed to emanate from the general himself. Where Coffee and Wallace and the prisoner squatted on the ground, however, there was no sign of strain at all. Instead, there was a steady gabble of voices. "What kind of rashes do they give you?" asked Coffee interestedly. The enemy prisoner listed them with profane side comments. "Well," said Wallace gloomily, "you ought to see what they get. Last week they fed us worse than dogs, and the canteen stuff." Your tank men, do they get treated fancy?" Coffee made a reply, consisting almost exclusively of high-powered expletives that I clearly could not say on the air. And the infantry gets it in the neck every time," he finished savagely. "We do the work." Guns began to boom far away, and Wallace cocked his ears. "Tanks getting together," he judged gloomily. "If they'd all blow each other down and let the infantry fight this battle." Damn the tanks," said the enemy prisoner viciously. "Look here, fellas, look at me. They sent a battalion of us out in 2 waves. We hike along the compass through the fog, supposed to be 5 paces apart. We come on a pillbox or a listening post, we gas it, and we go on. We try not to make a noise. We try not to get seen before we use the gas. We go on deep in your lines as we can. We hear one of your tanks, we dodge it if we can so we don't get seen at all. Of course, we give it a dose of gas in passing just in case, but we don't get any orders about how far to go or how to come back. We ask for recognition signals for our own tanks, and they grin and say we won't see any of our tanks till the battle's over. They say reform and march back when the fog is out. Isn't that pretty?" "You second wave?" asked Coffee with interest. The prisoner nodded. "Mopping up. Well, the first wave left. There's no fun in that. We go along gassing dead men all the time in your tanks, or raving around trying to figure out what happened to the listening post. They run into us." Coffee nodded sympathetically. "The infantry always gets the dirty end of the stick," said Willis morosely. Somewhere, something blew up with a violent explosion. The noise of battle in the distance became heavier and heavier. "They're really going at it strong," said the prisoner, listening. "Yeah," said Coffee. He looked at his wristwatch. "Say, that 20 minutes is up. You go down in there first, big boy." They stood beside the little pillbox. The prisoner's knees shook. "Say, fellers," he said pleadingly, they just told us that the stuff would scatter in 20 minutes, but you busted my mask, and yours ain't any good against this gas. I'll go down there if you make me, but..." Coffee lighted another of the prisoner's tailor-made cigarettes. "I'll give you 5 minutes more," he said graciously. I don't suppose it'll ruin the war." They sat down relievedly again, while the fog gas made all the earth invisible behind a pall of grayness, the grayness from which the noises of battle came. In the tank that was headquarters, the air of strain had grown more pronounced. The maneuver board now showed the situation as close to desperation. Now, the reserve tank positions had been switched on the board. Dim orange glows massed in curiously precise blocks, and little squares of green showed that there were supply and machine shop tanks that were massed. But the principal change lay on the front line indications. The red glows that showed where tank battles were in progress formed in an irregularly curved line now. There were 20 or more such isolated battles in progress, varying from single combats between single tanks to greater conflicts where 20 to 30 tanks to a side were engaged. And the positions of those conflicts were changing constantly, and invariably, the American tanks were being pushed back. The two staff officers behind the general were nearly silent. There were few sparks crawling within the American lines now. Nearly every one had been diverted into frontline battles. The two men watched the board with feverish intensity, watching the red glows moving back and back. The chief of staff was shaking like a leaf, watching the American lines stretch and stretch. The general looked at him with a twisted smile.
"I know my opponent,"
he said suddenly.
"I had lunch with him once in Vienna. We were attending a disarmament conference."
He seemed to be amused at the irony of that statement.
"We talked war and battles, of course, and he showed me, drawing on the tablecloth, the tactical scheme that should have been used at Cambrai back in 1917. It was a singularly perfect plan and a beautiful one."
"General!" burst out one of the two staff officers behind him. "I need 20 tanks from the reserves."
"Take them,"
said the general. He went on, addressing his chief of staff.
"It was an utterly flawless plan. I talked to other men. We were all pretty busy estimating each other there, we soldiers, and we discussed each other with some freedom, I may say. And I formed the opinion that a man who is in command of the enemy is an artist, a soldier with the spirit of an amateur." I think the writer may have meant an auteur. He's a very skillful fencer, by the way. Doesn't that suggest anything?
The chief of staff had his eyes glued to the board. "That this is a feint, sir. A strong feint, yes, but he has his force concentrated in the dead area."
"You're not listening, sir,"
said the general reprovingly.
"I'm saying that my opponent is an artist, an auteur, the sort of person who delights in the delicate work of fencing. I, sir, would thank heavens for the chance to defeat my enemy. He has twice my force, but he won't be content merely to defeat me. He will want to defeat me by a plan of consummate artistry, which will rise admiration among soldiers for many years to come."
"But, General, every minute, every second—"
"We're losing men, of whom we have plenty, and tanks, of which we have not enough." "True, very true,"
conceded the general.
"But I'm waiting to hear from those two strayed infantrymen. When they report, I'll speak to them myself."
"But, sir," cried the chief of staff, withheld only by the iron habit of discipline from violent action and taking over of command himself, "they may be dead. You can't risk this battle waiting for them. You can't risk it, sir. You just can't."
"They're not dead,"
said the general coolly.
"They cannot be dead. Sometimes, sir, we must obey the motto on our coins. Our country needs this battle to be won. We've got to win it, sir, and the only way to win it—"
The signal light at his telephone glowed. The general snatched it up, his hands quivering, but his voice was sturdy and deliberate as he spoke.
"Hello, Sergeant. Sergeant Coffee, is it? Very well, Sergeant. Tell me what you find out. Your prisoner objects to his rations, eh? Very well, go on. How did he gas our listening posts?" "He did, huh? He got turned around, you caught him wandering about?" "Oh, he was second wave. They weren't taking any chances on any of our listening posts reporting their tanks, huh? Say that again, Sergeant Coffee."
The general's tone had changed indescribably.
"Your prisoner has no recognition signals for his own tanks? They told him he wouldn't see any of them until the battle was over." "Thank you, Sergeant. One of our tanks will stop for you. This is the commanding general speaking."
He rang off, eyes blazing. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. There's a phone in the booth, so I was like, gotta do that. He rang off, eyes blazing. His relaxation had gone, and he was a dynamo, snapping orders.
Supply tanks, machine shop tanks, ground forces of the air service, concentrate here.
His finger rested on the spot in the middle of the dead area. Excuse me.
Reserve tanks take position behind them. Draw off every tank we've got. Take them out of action, and mass them in the front. On a line with our former first line of outposts. Every airplane and helicopter take the air and engage in general combat with the enemy, wherever the enemy may be found in whatever force. And our tanks move straight through here.
Orders were snapping into telephone transmitters. The commands had been relayed before their import was fully realized. Then there was a gasp. "General," cried the chief of staff, "if the enemy is massed there, he'll destroy our forces in detail as they take position."
He isn't massed there,
said the general, his eyes blazing.
The infantrymen who were gassing our listening posts were giving no recognition signals for their tanks. Sergeant Coffey's prisoner has his gas mask broken as in deadly fear. The enemy commander is foolish in many ways, perhaps, but not foolish enough to break down morale by refusing recognition signals to his own men who need them. And look at the beautiful plan he's got.
He sketched half a dozen lines with his fingers, moving them in lightning gestures as his orders took effect.
His main force is here, behind those skirmishes that look like a feint. As fast as we reinforce our skirmishing line, he reinforces his, just enough to drive our tanks back slowly. It looks like a strong feint, but it's a trap. This dead space is empty. He thinks we're concentrating to face it. When he's sure of it, his helicopters will sweep across any minute now to see that he'll throw his whole force on our front line. It'll crumple up. His whole fighting force will smash through to take us, facing the dead space in the rear. With twice our numbers, he'll drive us before him.
But, General, you're ordering concentration there. You're falling in with his plans. The general laughed.
I had lunch with the general in command over there once upon a time. As I've said, he's an artist. He won't be content with a defeat like that. He'll want to make his battle a masterpiece, a work of art. There's just one touch he can add. He has to have reserves to protect his supply tanks and machine shops. They're fixed. The ideal touch, the perfect tactical fillip, will be here, look. He expects to smash in our rear, here. The heaviest blow will fall here. He'll swing around our right wing, drive us out of the jet area into his own lines, and drive us on his reserves. Do you see it? He'll use every tank he's got in one beautiful final blow. We'll be outwitted, outnumbered, outflanked, and finally caught between his main body and his reserves and be pounded to bits. It's a perfect, masterly bit of work.
He watched the board, hawk-like.
We'll concentrate, but our machine shops and supplies will concentrate with us. Before he has time to take us in rear, we'll drive ahead in just the line he plans for us. We won't wait to be driven into his reserves. We roll into them and roll over them. We smash his supplies, destroy his shops, and then we can advance along his line of communication and destroy it, with our own depots being blown up, give the orders when necessary, and leaving him stranded on motor-driven tanks, motorized artillery, and nothing to run his motors with. He'll be marooned beyond help in the middle of our country, and we'll have him at a mercy when his tanks run out of fuel. As a matter of fact, I shall expect him to surrender in 3 days.
The little blocks of green and yellow that showed the position of the reserve and supply tanks changed abruptly to white and began to crawl across the maneuver board. Other little white sparks turned about, and every white spark upon the maneuver board suddenly took itself to a new direction.
Disconnect cables, said the general crisply. We move with our tanks, in the lead.
The monotonous humming of the electric generator was drowned out in a thunderous uproar that was muffled as an airtight door was shut abruptly. 15 seconds later, there was a violent lurch, and the colossal tank was on the move in the midst of a crawling, thundering horde of metal monsters whose lumbering progress shook the earth. Sergeant Coffey, still blinking his amazement, absent-mindedly lighted the last of his share of the cigarettes bluted from the prisoner. "The big guy himself," he said, still stunned. "My God, the big guy himself." A distant thunder began, a deep-toned rumbling that seemed to come from the rear. It came nearer and grew louder. A peculiar quivering seemed to set up in the earth. The noise was tanks moving through the fog, not 1 or 2 tanks, nor 20 tanks, but all the tanks in creation, rumbling and lurching at their topmost speed in serried array. Serried, does that mean hurried? Question of the day. Serried, of rows or people of things, standing close together, possibly based on the Latin for lock, Sarah. Sarah. Rather. Okay, neat. That's a neat word. There's your word for the day, everybody. Corporal Wallace heard and turned pale. The prisoner heard and his knees caved in. Oh, hell, Corporal Wallace said despairingly. They can't see us, and they couldn't dodge us if they did. The prisoner wailed and slumped to the floor. Coffee picked him up by the collar and jerked him out of the pillbox. Come on, Pete, he ordered briefly. They ain't give us an infantryman's chance. Maybe we can do some dodging. Then the roar of the engines, of metal treads crushing upon earth and clinking upon their joints, drowned out all their possible sounds. Before the 3 men beside the pillbox could have moved a muscle, monster shapes loomed up, rushing, rolling, lurching, squeaking. They thundered past, and the hot fumes of their exhausts enveloped the trio. Coffee growled and put himself in a position of defiance, his feet braced against the concrete of the pillbox dome. His expression was snarling and angry, but surreptitiously he crossed himself. He heard the fellows of the 2 tanks that had roared by him, thundering along in alignment to left and right. A 20-yard space, and a second row of the monsters came hurtling on, gun muzzles gaping, gas tubes elevated, spitting smoke from their exhaust that was even thicker than the fog. A third row, a fourth, a fifth. The universe was a monster uproar. One couldn't think in this volume of sound. It seemed that there was fighting overhead. Crackling noises came feebly through the reverberating uproar. It was the Army of the United States in full charge. Something came whirling down through the overhanging mist and exploded in a lurid flare that for a second or two cast the grotesque shadows for a row of tanks clearly before the trio of shaken infantrymen. And yet still the tanks came on and roared past. 20 tanks, 21, 22. Coffee lost count, dazed and almost stunned by the sheer noise. It rose from the earth and seemed to be echoed back from the topmost limit of the skies. It was a colossal din, an incredible uproar, a sustained thunder that beat at the eardrums like the reiterated concussions of 1,000 guns that fired without ceasing. There was, there was no intermission, no cessation of the tumult. Row after row after row of the monsters rolled by, beaked and armed, going greedily with hungry guns into battle. And then, for a space of seconds, no tanks passed. Through the pandemonium of their going, however, the sound of firing somehow seemed to creep. It was gunfire of incredible intensity, and it came from the direction in which the front-rank tanks were heading. 48, 49, 4010, 4011, murmured Coffee dazedly, his senses beaten down almost to unconsciousness by the ordeal of sound. Good heavens, the whole army's gone by. The roaring of the fighting tanks was less now, but it was still a monstrous din. Through it, however, came now a series of concussions that were so close together that they were almost inseparable, and so violent they were like slaps upon the chest. Then came the other noises, louder only because they were nearer. These were different noises too, Then came the other noises, louder only because they were nearer. These were different noises, too, from the noises the fighting tanks had made. They were lighter. The curious, misshapen service tanks began to rush by, of all sizes and all shapes. Fuel carrier tanks, machine shop tanks, huge ones these, commissary tanks. Something enormous and glistening stopped short. A door opened, and a voice roared an order. The 3 men, beaten and whipped by noise, stared dumbly. "Started Coffee," roared the voice. "Bring your men, quick!" Coffee dragged himself back to a semblance of life. And Corporal Wallace moved forward, sagging. The 2 of them loaded their prisoner into the door and tumbled in. They were instantly set into a heap as the tank took up its progress again with a sudden sharp leap. "Good man," grinned a sooty-faced officer clinging to a handhold. The general sent special orders you were to be picked up. Said you'd won the battle. It isn't finished yet, but when the general says that... Battle? This ain't my battle. It's a parade of tanks. There was a howl of joy from somewhere above. Discipline in the machine shop tanks was strict enough, but vastly different in kind from the formality of the fighting machines. Contact, roared the voice again. General Wireless is going again. Our fellows have rolled over their reserves and are smashing their machine shops and supplies. Yells reverberated deafeningly inside the steel walls, already filled with tumult from the running motors and rumbling treads. Smashed 'em up, shrieked the voice above, insane with joy. Smashed 'em, smashed 'em, smashed 'em. We've wiped out their whole reserve and... A series of detonations came through, even the steel shell of the lurching tank. Detonations so violent, so monstrous, that even through the springs and treads of the tank, the earth concussion could be felt. There goes their ammunition. We've set off all their dumps. There was sheer pandemonium inside the service tank, speeding behind the fighting force with only a thin skin of reserve tanks between it and a panic-stricken, mechanically pursuing enemy. Yell, you birds! Screamed the voice. The general says we've won the battle, thanks to this fighting force. We've got to go on and wipe out the enemy line of communications, letting him chase us till his gas gives out. Then we come back and pound him to bits. Our tanks have wiped him out. Coffee seemed to find something to hold on to, and he struggled to his feet. Corporal Wallace, however, was recovering from the certainty of death and the torture of sound, and was very seasick from the tank's motion. The prisoner moved away from him on the steel floor, and he looked gloomily up at Coffee. Listen to him, said Coffee bitterly. Tanks, tanks, tanks. Hell, if they gave infantry a chance... Yeah, you said it, said the prisoner savagely. This is sure one hell of a way to fight a war. Corporal Wallace turned a greenish face to them. The infantry always gets the dirty end of the stick, he gasped. Now they make an infantry riding tanks. All right, that's the end of that tank story, which, if I may be frank, not as good as the rest of the ones that were in this collection. I'm going to take a moment to drink some tea, and I'll put up a little bumper so y'all don't have to hear me drinking tea, because I know those noises are a little obnoxious to some of you.
Like reading the newspaper? Well, how about writing for one? St. Ambrose University's student-run newspaper is giving you the opportunity to show off your writing skills. Not a fan of writing? Have no fear. You can also take pictures, draw, or even design for the Buzz as well. Meetings take place in the back of Cosgrove Computer Lab every Monday at 11. If you're interested, contact editor Haley Gibbs at gibbshaleyr@sau.edu. That's gibbshaleyr@sau.edu. The Buzz. So much more than just a newspaper.
You know, I really should read The Buzz since I'm on campus anyway and they're all over the place. I've heard it's it's really good for a campus newspaper. But anyway, I went to a break so you guys could avoid the tea drinking sounds, and yet you still got some of them. You're welcome. Anyway, we're moving on to what I assume... Let's look at the table of contents here. Let's see. Table of contents here. Yeah. We're on the final story in the January issue, and it's called Invisible Death. It's by Anthony Poucher. The inquest into the mysterious death of Darius Darrow, savant, inventor, recluse, and eccentric, resembled a scientific convention. Men and women of high scientific attainment, and in some instances, world fame, attended to hear firsthand the strange, uncanny, unbelievable circumstances as hinted by the newspapers. Miss Susan Darrow, the widow, was the paramount witness. She appeared a quaint figure as she took the stand. Tearful, yet alert, this little woman betrayed the intelligence that made her one of the world's foremost chemists. She gave her age as 58, but if it had not been for her snowy hair, she would have looked much younger. She was small, but not frail, and had expressive blue eyes. She had a firm little nose and chin, and was garbed in black silk garments of a fashion evidently dating back a decade. Although not modern in dress, her answers to questions regarding scientific and business affairs involved in the mysterious case proved she was thoroughly abreast of the times in all other particulars.
You believe your husband was murdered?
Bluntly asked the examiner at one stage. That is my opinion, she said, and then added, It might have been some scientific accident, the nature of which I cannot fathom. We were confidential in all matters except my husband's work. He reserved the right to be secretive about the scientific problems on which he was working.
Can you throw any light on a motive for such a crime?
The motive seems self-evident. He was working on an invention that he said would do away with war and make the owner of the device a practical world dictator should he choose to exercise such power. The device was completed. The murderer killed him to secure his device. That all seems plain enough.
Was anything else of value taken?
We had nothing else of value about the place. I was never given to jewelry. The furnishings and equipment were undisturbed. It's quite evident, I think, that the thief was no ordinary petty burglar. The attorney interposed. I believe we'd better let Miss Darrow tell this story from the beginning in her own way. There are really only two important witnesses. Whatever she can remember to recite might be of value to the authorities. Now, Miss Darrow, how long have you lived at Brooknook? Begin there and just let your story unfold. Try to control your nerves and emotions. I am not emotional and I am not nervous, the quaint little woman said bravely. My heart hurts, that is all. This place was named by my father. We inherited it at his death 30 years ago and moved in. My two children were born and died there. At first we kept the servants and maintained all of the 32 rooms. But after the children were gone, we both gave ourselves over to the study, and we began to close one room after another, releasing the servants one by one.
And how many rooms do you occupy now?
We lived in 3, a living room, kitchen, and a bedroom. The 2 big parlors were turned into a laboratory, and we both worked there. It was there my husband met his death at his work. Sometimes we worked together, sometimes independently. I did all my own housework except for the laundry, which I sent out. We had no visitors. We lived for each other and our work.
Tell us about the rooms that were not occupied.
We left them just as they always had been. I hadn't been into any of these rooms for 20 years. Once I looked into the little girl's room, my daughter's room. It was dusty and cobwebby, but undisturbed by human hand. My husband peered in over my shoulder, and I closed the door. We turned away in each other's arms. Here the little old woman fell weeping softly into her lace handkerchief. Minutes lapsed. Words, they're hard. Minutes lapsed as the court waited, respecting her grief. Were those rooms locked? Said the attorney finally. No. We feared no one. All the rooms were closed, but not locked. The outside doors were seldom locked. We lived in our own world. For appearance's sake, we kept up the grounds. Peck, the gardener, kept the grounds, as you know. He called in outside help when necessary. This was his affair, and we never bothered him. He lived probably a half-mile up the road. The first of each month he would come for his pay. He was practically our only visitor. When it was necessary to see our attorney or other connections, Peck would drive us. At first he used to drive our horses. 10 years ago we pastured the horses for life and bought the small car. We seldom went out. We have no close friends and no relatives nearer than the Pacific coast. They're distant cousins. You see, we were rather alone in the world since the children went away. We never spoke of them as being dead. Again the court was hushed. The coroner and the attorney took occasion to blow their noses rather violently. On May 27th, the day your husband died, what happened as you remember it? Asked the attorney. We arose and had breakfast as usual. I was puttering about the rooms. My husband kissed me and I started for the laboratory. I was in the kitchen, It was about 10 o'clock when I finished there and went into the living room, which adjoins the laboratory. I'd been rather fretted, something unusual for me. It seemed I dimly sensed the presence of someone near me, someone I didn't know, an outsider. I thought it was foolish of me and bucked up. But when I went to the living room, it seemed as if some invisible presence were following me. Then I could hear the low hum of my husband's device. The door of the laboratory was open. He called to me and said,
"Sue, dear, it seems strange, but I made 2 models of this set, and now I can only find 1. You couldn't have misplaced the other by any chance, could you?"
I assured him I knew nothing of it, and he went, that's funny. Then he went back into the library and closed the door, where the humming continued. I was more annoyed than ever, but I didn't want to bother my husband. Then a most queer thing happened. I saw the door of the laboratory open and close, but I didn't see anyone. The next instant, I heard my husband's outcry, and it was more of a groan than a scream. I rushed into the laboratory. My husband was lying by his slate-topped table. The device, I noticed, was gone. It was no bigger than a coffee mill, I thought, as I bent over my husband. How strange how such a thought could have crowded in at such a time. My husband's ear was bleeding. It was a cut, a long gash over the ear, just below the bald spot. It must have been a frightful blow. I looked at his eyes. My nurses and pharmaceutical courses gave me knowledge which sent a chill to my heart. He was dead. I must have fainted. When I recovered, I ran for Peck. I found him near the house, coming my way and holding his right eye.
"Something struck me,"
he said. Then seeing me so pale, he said, "My God, Miss Darrow, what has happened?" "Run for the doctor," I said. When the doctor came, he called the police and the coroner. They told me not to disturb the body. Later they took it away, and the gardener told me, Never mind what Peck told you. We'll let him tell it. Is that all you can tell about the death itself?" But the widow was weeping now, so violently that the court ordered her excused. Oh, sorry, I bumped into something. Don't know if y'all could hear that. The gardener was called and took the stand, displaying a rather large black eye, which offered a bit of comedic relief to what was otherwise pathetic situation. On the main road to the east, he began after preliminary questioning, was a small car which had been parked there all morning. I noticed it because it had no license plates. It was visible from the inside of the grounds, but it was hidden from the road by a hedge. It made me wonder because it was just inside our grounds. I had some very special red flags which I planted as a border back of some pink geraniums. They were doing fine. I got them from the Fabrish seed house. There are no plants like Fabrish's. I wouldn't give a snap of my finger for all the other. Now, just a minute, interrupted the attorney. He told the gardener to never mind the geranium and flags, but to just tell what happened. Well, I was bending over the border bed when I heard sounds like someone running along the gravel path towards me. I heard a humming like a bumblebee, then I jumped to my feet. Just then something hit me in the eye and knocked me down. Yes, sir, knocked me plumb down.
Then what happened? Never mind the asides, the extras, just tell us the simple facts,
instructed the attorney. Well, you won't believe it, but I heard the footsteps leave the road. The geraniums were badly trampled. I looked at the parked automobile, and I could hear the hum coming from there. The machine started and turned onto the road.
Did you notice anyone at the wheel?
That's what you're not going to believe. There wasn't anybody in that auto at all. I didn't see anyone at any time. The auto started itself, and what's more, it only went 100 yards when it disappeared altogether, like that. Like a flash. Did it turn off the road? It didn't turn anywhere. It was in the middle of the road, and then it just disappeared, right there in the middle of the road. Started without a driver, turned north without a driver, went off by itself for about 100 yards, then it just vanished, dropped right out of sight. The courtroom was hushed. The audience and court attaches were awe-stricken and looked there incredulously.
Do you mean to tell me that the auto drove itself?
Asked the court sternly. The witness was completely confused. The attorney came to his rescue, looked at the cord, and said, "He's told us that same story 100 times, and he'll stick to it. It seems impossible, but has not Miss Darrow told us she heard humming this morning and saw nothing? With the purely perfunctory recitals of the doctors and the constable of this court and the jury have heard than all there is to hear. There's no more witnesses, that's all there is. The jury will have to decide from the evidence whether this case is an accident or a murder. The doctor and 2 experts have reported that the wound appeared to have been made by some blunt instrument that was swung powerfully. The skull under the wound and back of the ear was simply crushed. Death was instantaneous. It happened all in broad daylight. After an hour's deliberation, the jury decided the savant came to his death in his laboratory from a blow on the skull received in some manner unknown. Even though that's what the coroner exactly just found? Okay, cool. The crowd filed out, spiritedly discussing the unusual crime. In the crowd was Perkins Ferguson, known as Old Perk, head of the Sherford Engineering Corporation, who paid royalty on some of the Darrow patents. With him was Damon Farnsworth, his first vice president.
Well, how do you think of it?
Asked Farnsworth, biting into a black cigar.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? I have my own theory, however, but I'm going to know a whole lot more about this case before I venture it.
The pair climbed into Ferguson's car, discussing the Darrow death case, with furrowed brows. What might be termed an extraordinary meeting of the directors of the Sherford Engineering Corporation was held a few days later in the big building in the financial district. The rich furnishing of the directors' room indicated, better than Bradstreet's, the great wealth of the corporation. Uniformed pages stood at attention at the end of the long mahogany table at which were seated the 14 directors of the company. All were men of wealth, standing and engineering knowledge. Excuse me. The departed Darrow had often been summoned to such meetings, and at this one there was a hush because of his recent demise. After a batch of preliminary business had been transacted, Ferguson arose and cleared his throat. The directors leaned forward in their chairs expectantly, and the page boys lost their mechanical attitude for the instant and craned their necks around for the bulk of forms in front of them.
The Darrow case has taken a sudden and sinister turn, said the president. I have a letter, and I will read it. Old Perk, get wise to yourself. We're in a position to destroy you and all the potbellies in the Wall Street crowd. If you want to die of old age, remember what happened to Darrow, and begin declaring us in on Wall Street dividends. If you do not, you'll follow Darrow in the same way. Our first demand is for $100,000. Leave this amount in hundreds and fifties in the rubbish can at the corner of 50th Street and Broadway at 10 a.m. next Thursday. If you fail, we'll break your neck. Bring the police with you if you like. Invisible death.
$100,000 in 1920 is how much now? Let's find out. The internet says that it's well over $1 million now. So they're asking for what equivalently would be $1 million. That's quite the ransom. Holy cow. Ferguson passed the letter around for inspection. It was painstakingly printed, evidently from the type in a rubber stamp set, such as sold in toy stores. I've decided, said Perkins at length, to give this case to Walter Lees. He's never failed us in mechanical, chemical, or any form of scientific problem, and I hope he will not fail in this. He'll work independently of the police, who've requested that we keep the appointment at 50th Street and Broadway at the hour named. We will deposit a roll of newspapers, around which has been wrapped a $50 bill, and then we'll stand by while the awaiting detectives do their duty. You don't think anyone's going to call for any supposed package of money at one of the most congested corners in the world in broad daylight? Asked the director at the end of the table. Well, why not? Asked Ferguson. A seedy individual could pick a package from the rubbish bin at that corner without attracting the least attention. I guess you're right, agreed the doubting one.
I know I'm right,
said the president, and he usually was.
I've already arranged to have Lees instructed in this work,
Ferguson volunteered as a pause came in the buzz of conversation about the table.
Lees is young, but he is capable.
There was general discussion of the strange case of Darius Darrow, the room filled with the blue haze of many cigars. Suddenly, a low humming sound was heard in the room. Papers on the director's table were bunched as if by unseen hands and thrown to the ceiling, from which they descended like flakes of snow and scattered about the room. The book of minutes was torn from the hands of a secretary. It was raised and brought down on Vice President Farnsworth's head. A chair was pulled out from under another director, and he was deposited in an undignified heap on the floor. Another director acted as though he'd been tripped, and he fell on top of Farnsworth. 2 big vases crashed to the floor in bits. Other decorative objects were scattered about. The directors who'd been hurtled to the floor stood up with expressions of comical surprise on their features. Their chairs catapulted into the far corner of the room, one after another, and startled expressions resounded from within the group. A small bookcase fell on its front with a crash of glass, and Ferguson's cane jumped in the air and crashed a window pane. The humming ceased suddenly. The room was a wreck. The assembled men stood aghast. They were simply nonplussed. Finally, they phoned for the police. After hearing the strange recital from so many highly reputable witnesses, a detective sergeant who had responded to the call with others had reported to headquarters. A uniformed police guard was sent to the place with instructions to remain on duty until relieved. Ferguson had sent for Walter Lees. I can't not say that with that accent, I guess. Sent for Walter Lees, the young engineer of whom he'd spoken to the directorate. Assigned to the task of unraveling the Darrow death mystery, Lees ran true to form by getting busy at once. This was at the midnight of the day of the surprising director's meeting. Lees owned a big car. He piled into it and started for the scene of the crime. Daybreak found him examining every inch of the road around the Darrow estate. Then he searched the hedge along the east road where the phantom auto had disappeared after the crime. The brush along the opposite side of the thoroughfare was also gone over. Passing autos had stopped to ask the meaning of this flashlight. Lees explained he'd lost a pocketbook. It was as good excuse as any, and served to keep him from drawing a crowd. He found nothing to reward his long and painstaking efforts. At 7 a.m., he decided to interview the Darrow widow and found her already up and about her kitchen, weeping softly as she worked. She bade him be seated in the living room. "No, I am not afraid to stay here alone," she said in reply to Lee's first question. "Whoever killed my husband did so to get possession of his second model. They'd already stolen the first. I thought that they were afraid the finding of the second model after his death would aid in their detection. For some reason, they had to have both models." She agreed to tell all she knew of the case. Lees listened to the long recital, as already recorded at the coroner's inquest. By adroit questioning, Lees gained just one new fact. Miss Darrow remembered that she'd called her husband, just before he retired to his laboratory, to fix a towel hanger in the kitchen. He found a pivot needed oiling," explained the widow. "That was all. He oiled it and went into the laboratory." The idea of one of the world's greatest mechanical engineers stopping his work to oil a towel hanger caused Lees to smile, but Miss Darrow didn't do the same. "My husband was a genius at repairing about the house," she said in all seriousness.
Well, I can imagine so,
agreed Lees. The conversation ceased, and Lee sat for a few minutes with his head in his hands, thinking deeply. Finally, he said, "I'm convinced that someone who was well aware of your husband's habits has committed this crime. Do you believe, positively, that the gardener is above suspicion?" "Oh, it couldn't have been Peck," insisted Miss Darrow. "I'd seen him down near the gate from the window. He was too far from the house, and besides, he was devoted to us both." "Then it was somebody from the neighborhood?" said Lise. "Maybe so," replied Miss Darrow, non-committally. "Who lives in the house next south?" "That's towards the city," mused the widow. "There are no houses south on either side of the road for a little further than a mile, but when you reach the town limits of Farsdale, the town line's halfway between, and it marks the southern end of this estate." "Well, who lives in the first house to the north?" "That is the cottage of Peck, the gardener." "How near is the next house after that?" "That was the parcel my father sold. It's about 3 acres, and in the center, or about the center, is a house built by Adolphe Jouret, who bought the land. He lives there with his daughter. They built a magnificent place. The brook that traverses our grounds rises at a spring at the back of his house. Save for 2 West Indian servants, they're alone. The servants live in Farsdale and motor back and forth." "What do you know of this... what's his name?" queried Lise, who had assumed the role of examiner. "Jouret? Very little. He's some sort of circus man or showman, or he was before he retired. He once had wealth, but my husband, some weeks ago, said that because of some ill-advised investments, he was not so well rated as formerly. I had the feeling he might be forced to give up the place. I just felt that, however. I don't have any proof. I just never had heard it. I'm so sorry because of the daughter. A beautiful girl, and she seemed kindly. The one time I saw her anyway. She was about 12 then. I don't like to say it, but she seemed a little dazed or slow-witted. But, of course, she was still beautiful." Miss Darrow fell to smoothing out the folds in her house apron as Lise asked, "When was the only time you saw her?" "Well, 10 years, just about. Just after my father's death. They called on us. We didn't care to continue the friendship, as Jouret seemed a little flamboyant. I suppose it was his circus nature. Anyway, we were quiet folks. There was no need of close association with the neighbors. I remember," continued the widow after a pause, "that Jouret, when he heard my husband was a scientist, simulated an interest in science. He did have a smattering knowledge to his credit, but it was plainly an affectation, so we decided to just let him drop. No ill feeling. We weren't interested." "You don't approve of circus people?" "It's not that. Any honest work is honorable. It just seems commendable to furnish amusement for the public. I know little about people of his profession, but I'm sure they're perfectly all right." "It was Jouret personally. He seemed noisy and insincere. The girl was nice, though. I loved her." "That's all you know of the Jourets?" "And that's all." "Miss Darrow, I wish to go through this house from attic to basement. Do you have any objections to this?" "None whatsoever. Make yourself free, but don't attach any significance to what appears to be a secret passageway and cave. My father was a biological chemist. He used to experiment with small animals. He had a cave where he stored chemicals, and I believe you'll find old chemicals stored down there now. I disturb nothing." The widow forced a smile to her lips. "Will you excuse me?" she concluded. "I'm trying to carry on." Sorry about that random, just complete silence. Figured I should mute the mic if I'm going to drink any more tea. Just don't want you guys to have to deal with that sound anymore. Anyway, Lee's carrying a flashlight, began a systematic search of the premises. He made his way up a winding staircase, through dust and cobwebs, to the attic. Ooh, excuse me. He found the top story filled with trunks and bits of furniture of a previous generation. All was in order, albeit dust-covered and cobwebby. Someone has been here before me, he said to himself, brushing a mist of cobwebs from his coat sleeves. There's a path brushed through the spider webs. Turning his flashlight on the floor, he exclaimed, "And there's footprints in this dust. Well, I'll be." Then after some study, he mused, "Of course there's been someone here. The killer of Darrow probably has been here to see what he could see. It was no great task. The doors were never locked. The footprints are of no value, except maybe to give me the size of his shoes." He measured the footprints carefully, and then went downstairs and phoned the measurements to a local shoe dealer, asking him to give the trade size of shoes which would make such prints. "They're number 9s, decided the shoe dealer. Lees then returned to resume his search in the rooms and corridors. "I wonder if Urain wears 9s, he questioned himself. "What if he does? I can't convict him on that. Oh, but it might help." And then he fell to searching through the old trunks. He found old photographs, articles of apparel, knickknacks, grandmother's and grandfather's belongings, all of them, and some children's clothes of the days when little boys wear ruffles about their necks and little girls' pantalettes reach to their ankles. Carefully, each article was replaced, and he made his way down to the third and then the second floor. Through cobwebby corridors and bedchambers he searched, but didn't find anything further to aid his case. In the unused room what is English? Sorry. In the unused rooms on the first floor, he found an old spinning wheel, candle molds, and utensils used in cooking in the days when housewives cooked over an open fire. Soon enough, he stumbled upon the secret passageway, and there Darrow came to his aid. Leading from the basement was a coal chute. The chute was formed in a triangle with a point under a trap. It was man-high at the cellar opening, and its floor was a slide for fuel. It had been in use, evidently, quite recently. At the cellar wall of this chute, Miss Darrow pressed what appeared to be a knot in the old timber and pushed open a door. Dude, that's cool. A dank odor issued forth as the door was opened. Lees entered the passage, and Miss Darrow returned upstairs. Following the underground passageway, Lees came onto a cave about 14 by 14 feet in size, with a ceiling and walls of arched brick. It had evidently been built before the days of cement construction. A long bench and shelves with carboys and jars of chemicals were the only furnishings. Lees sounded all the walls, but found nothing further to interest him. Lees returned to town at the urging of Old Perk, who had arranged with great care to keep the appointment at 50th Street and Broadway, where the decoy package was to be left. He had snipers in nearby windows. He had detectives dressed in the strange guard of the people who live habitu, a resident or frequent visitor to a particular place. So, he had detectives dressed in the strange garb of the habitus of the neighborhood, patrolling the corner, and he and his own guard parked in an automobile against all traffic rule at the curb near the rubbish can. An office boy sauntered up to the rubbish can, threw in the decoy package, and then sauntered away. A second later, there was a low humming sound. The decoy package fairly jumped out of the rubbish can and disappeared in thin air. The humming sound seemed to round the corner into 50th Street. Detectives followed on the jump, and the humming approached at an auto at a curb, and the auto's self-starter began to function. As the police stood nearby enough to have jumped into the auto, the whole machine, a big touring car, completely disappeared before their eyes. Consternation is a mild word when used to describe the result. All forces set to trap the extortionist gathered in a group, and in their surprise and disappointment began discussing the strange case in loud tones. A crowd was gathering which was blocking traffic. Old Perk was the first to recover from his Old Perk was the first to recover from his surprise. "Get the hell out of this neighborhood," he yelled to his working forces. "All of you get down to my office." The working force dissolved and Old Perk drove away. At Old Perk's office, shortly afterward, a conference of the defeated forces of the law and of science was held. Old Perk stormed and raged, and the detective The Old Perk stormed and raged, and the detective captain in charge fumed and fussed, but nothing came of it all. One was as powerless as another. Finally, the conference adjourned. The next morning in the mail, Perkins Ferguson, president of the Sheaford Engineering Corporation, received a letter carefully printed in the rubber type. It read, Thanks for the $50 bill. You cheated us by $99,950. This'll never do. Don't be like that. You poor fools, you make us increase our demand. We double it. Leave $200,000 on your desk and leave the desk unlocked. We'll get it. Every time you ignore one of our demands, one of your number will die. Take this matter seriously. Last warning. Invisible death. Not another dime they'll get out of me, mused Ferguson. He started opening the rest of his mail. A clerk entered and handed him a telegram. It read, Damon Farnsworth, struck down at breakfast table. Family heard humming sound as he fell from his chair. Removed to medical center. Skull reported fractured. May die. William Devons, Chief of Police, Larchmont. Ferguson wildly seized the telephone. Get me Farnsworth south at Larchmont, he shouted to his operator.
The Stinger. KALA HD3, Davenport.
Well, that's a little embarrassing. I apparently seem to have forgotten to turn back on my mic. So if I... Oh, darn, none of those were chapters. Well, let's see where we were here. The last thing everyone heard probably was the... Probably was the fact that... I'll just start here from the phone was answered by Jones, the butler. "This is Ferguson." An agitated voice replied, "Oh, sir, yes, sir. It's true, sir. He's bleeding at the head, sir. Something hit him." "Let me talk to Miss Farnsworth." "They're at the hospital, sir." "One of the boys, then?" "Both are at the hospital, sir." "Do you think he'll live?" "How can I say, sir? I don't know anything." Ferguson called the medical center, and they permitted him to talk to a doctor and a nurse. The nurse referred him to the doctor, who said,
"He's unconscious. There's a wicked fracture at the base of his brain. He was struck from the back with a club, I believe. He may die without regaining consciousness. I'm hoping he'll rally, and that'll be all right."
Ferguson ordered his car, and with Lees at his heels, jumped in the tonneau. He heard a humming sound back of him, and looked back and saw nothing. Both he and Lees were too impressed for words.
"Step on it,"
Ferguson ordered the chauffeur.
"Drive us to the medical center."
At the world's largest group of hospitals, Ferguson's worst fears were confirmed. The patient was reported sinking. Ferguson, giant of Wall Street, was a low-spirited man as he drove back town to his office. With Lees, he passed through the outer offices, buzzing with business and the click of typewriters. Not a head was raised from a desk or machine. It was a well-drilled force. Into his private sanctum he walked, or rather, dragged himself, and wearily he sat down. He pushed a pile of papers from him and ran his hand over his hot brow. Blood pounded at his temples. For the first time in his life, he faced a situation which was too deep for his understanding. Over and over again, he reviewed the uncanny events as Lees sat awaiting orders.
"I cannot have them killing off my friends like that,"
he mused finally. He called the clerk.
"Go to the bank and get $200,000 in 50s and 100s,
he commanded. When the clerk returned with the money, he laid the package on his desk and left the desk open.
"This might appear cowardly, but it'll give us time,"
he said. Lees didn't offer an opinion. Ferguson drew a personal note for $200,000 and sent it to the Sherford Corporation's attorneys. This amount represented a large part of Ferguson's personal assets, not those which were involved with any company, not to mention a large part of Ferguson's personal assets, as in those which weren't involved with any company he was connected. He then told Lees to go about his further investigations, and left the office and started for his home.
"I'll bank my life Lees will have those crooks lined up within a week,"
he assured himself as he lolled in his auto, bound homeward. But his voice sounded hollow, and the blood still pounded at his temples. Reaching home, he found a call from the Western plant at Chicago, and he phoned the superintendent with a foreboding that all was not well. "Is you, Pack?" sounded the voice on the wire.
"Yes, what's up?"
"I hadn't intended bothering you with this, but in the light of all that's happened, I guess you'd better know that one of our engineers around here went stark mad, hair tearing him. Anyway, it was about 3 weeks ago. He was a very brainy man, but his reason snapped. He first appeared bent out of shape when he started talking about anarchy, and he's cursing capitalists. Then one afternoon, he struck a shop foreman down with a heavy wrench and rushed out of the plant. We haven't seen him since, and the police has been looking for him, but he's still at large."
"That explains a lot of things,"
said old Perk.
"Tell the police to keep after him. We'll look for him here. Find me a completely detailed report of the incident by telegraph," he instructed.
Then he asked,
How's the foreman? Badly hurt?
Well, he dodged. It was a glancing blow. The foreman was back to work in a week. But he's nervous and he's armed himself. We put on a few extra guards, too.
Good. Don't hesitate to spend tolls to keep me advised of any developments.
An hour and a half later, Ferguson phoned the chief clerk in his offices.
Go to my private office, he ordered, and see if there's a package on my desk. It's a brag package.
The clerk returned in a few moments. There's no package on your desk, Mr. Ferguson.
That's all I wanted to know,
said Ferguson and hung up the receiver. Then Ferguson called up the Darrow home and tried to get in touch with Lee's, but was unable to do so. As Miss Darrow said, she's not seen him since he's been called back to the office. The reason Ferguson couldn't reach Lee's was because Lee's decided to learn once and for all if Jouret wore number 9 shoes. He started for the Jourets in his own car. It was a beautiful country he was traversing, but he had no time to note that the tree branches almost met over his head, and that this way was bordered with a profusion of wild flowers displaying a rainbow of colors. The house of Jouret, the retired circus performer, sat back far from the road, against the side of a beautiful hill, and was surrounded by poplars. The landscape was wilder and more natural than that of the Darrow place adjoining. The door was opened by a Puerto Rican boy. Lees lost no time, and he said bluntly, "Tell your master that a gentleman is here to see him on very particular business." Jouret himself came back with the boy. "What is it?" he asked, smiling a welcome. "I'm working on the case of the death of Mr. Darrow, your neighbor. I believe you may have seen something, and I thought you might aid me." Jouret betrayed no surprise. "Come in," he said. He led the way to a large reception room and asked his visitor to be seated. He was the soul of affability, short, husky, and florid. His eyes large, black, and staring. His hair black as well, quite long and curling upward at the ears. He was dressed in black, and he had the appearance of a big fat crow. "I'm glad you came," he greeted his guest, "for I've far too few callers." He switched on a big electric punch light in the middle of the room, because it was dusk, after all. It was getting dark. "We've been told that you're a retired circus man?" "Well, not exactly," said Jouret. "I traveled on the continent, finally journeying to Australia and then to the States. I crossed the country from San Francisco and settled down here. I was known as Elias the Great. I had my own company and property. It was a magic show. It wasn't a circus, although we did carry 2 elephants, 3 camels, some ponies, snakes, birds, and smaller animals. That's where the circus report came from. When I retired, I sold my stock to a circus. The newspapers regarded it as funny, and one of them printed a half-page story with pictures about the public sale. It was very much exaggerated. They mentioned giraffes, hyenas, and a lot of other animals I never possessed. Odd, wasn't it? Getting so much publicity after I was through needing it. However, I never in those days dodged the limelight." Jouret ended his speech with a loud and hearty guffaw. "Ha ha 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 ha." "I will call my daughter," Joy appended. "She'll be so glad to meet you." He left the room. Lise had taken occasion to note the size of Jouret's feet. They were small, almost effeminate, more likely 5s or 6s than 9s. Soon Jouret returned with a girl in her early 20s. She was blonde and radiantly beautiful. Doris Jouret bowed and smiled in a perfectly friendly manner. Lise noted that there was something about her eyes that made her appear dazed. Jouret monopolized the conversation, giving no one a chance to edge in a word. "This gentleman desires information in connection with the death of our neighbor, Mr. or is it Dr. Darrow. I want you to assure him, as I will, that we've seen or noted nothing that could possibly throw light on the strange case." The girl nodded, though it seemed a little wearily, and Jouret was off on another conversational flight. "I, too, am a man of scientific attachments," he chattered. "I'm a biologist, toxicologist, doctor of medicine, geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, and somewhat of a mechanic and electrician. I've given long hours to the study of strange sciences and metaphysics, to which you men give too little attention. There are sciences which would transcend any of the sphere. There's a higher astronomy. I neglected to say that I'm an astronomer." "Yeah?" "Yes." The girl had adopted a rather theatrical pose, which disclosed considerable of her charms, and said nothing at all. When you find your man, volunteered Jure, you'll find a madman. He said this ponderously and with a gesture evidently meant to be expressive. You believe a madman did it? Undoubtedly. It was a paranoiac with delusions of money, grandeur, and a strongly developed homicidal mania. To me, that's the only sensible solution. I'm quite sure they did him correct. Lisa rose to go, and Jure did not urge him to stay. He bowed Lise out, and Doris bowed with him. She's a beautiful girl, mused Lise once he was outside. Lise ran over in his mind the circumstances of his visit to Jure. There was no doubt in his mind that Jure's shoes were too small to be number 9s. In reason, this fact might tend to eliminate Jure, but he wasn't satisfied. I'm going to go get some gas, he told himself, and then I'm going to go get 2 private detectives to assist me, for I'm going right back there. For the first time in my life, I'm going to be a peeping Tom. There's no moon. The poplars will give us a view of all 3 floors of that house, if they leave their blinds up enough, and 3 of us can watch all 3 floors at once. He phoned Ferguson that he might be busy for days, joined a pair of operatives from the detective agency, and for some time the 3 operated on a well-conceived plan. It was probably a week later that Lise rendered a report to Perkins Ferguson, which for a time proved one of the strangest documents in the weird case. It read, "You probably think I'm crazy." No, wait, that's not Jure, that's Lise, so... "You probably think I'm crazy, and for this reason I'm having this report subscribed and sworn to jointly and severally." Excuse me. Excuse me, sorry. Let's hope I don't get a case of the hiccups. "With my 2 detectives, I've seen Miss Jure, the girl I told you about over the phone, in 3 places at one and the same time. Not once, but twice this has happened. Looking through the windows of the Jure place at night, we saw the girl on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor of the house. We believed it was due to a clever arrangement of mirrors, but figure this out. The next day she drove to a town, and we followed. She got out at one theater it entered. She didn't come back that we could see, but the car drove off. There was no chauffeur, and we thought we'd discovered the driverless auto until we saw Miss Jure still at the wheel. She got out and entered another theater. She didn't come back, but the car drove off with her still at the wheel yet again. She entered a 3rd theater after parking the car, and this time the driver's seat and tonneau were empty. Reverse the reel, and you'll see her coming out of the 3 theaters and driving home. That's what happened. There must be 3 of her, all identical, but only one shows at a time. If it's some of Jure's far-famed magic, I'd say he's some sort of conjurer. The explanation's not yet forthcoming. We want to shadow Jure, but he never goes anywhere. The girl has only been out the one time when she attended 3 matinees as described, believe it or not. The next night, we each, the 2 detectives and I, tried to steal a march on one another and called her up and asked her to go out. To our individual surprise, she agreed in each case. To our collective surprise, she kept all 3 dates in the same night. She walked through the trees in this vicinity with me. She also drove down the road in the auto with one of my detectives and went dancing with the other. She was in 3 places miles apart at one and the same time. We each brought her home within a half hour of the other, and were swearing to that. Either we're all hypnotized, or there are 3 identical Mrs. Jure. Jure himself treats us all wonderfully, gives us the run of the house, and tries to talk us to death. The strange document. Hold on, just a moment. The strange document was subscribed by Lise and the 2 detectives. Oops, I dropped something. Excuse me for a moment. The strange document was subscribed by Lise and the 2 detectives and was held by Ferguson pending developments. The next report from Lise read, I had a chance to prowl around the Jure house a little while waiting for Miss Jure to dress. I met her twice in my ramblings, and a few minutes later she met me again, this time in a different costume. I got a chance to search the woods back of Jure's house in the evening. I found a spot where the earth had been disturbed and dug up a pair of shoes. They were number 9s. A fourth report from him read, "We found the body of the crazed engineer. He drowned himself in a lake. This eliminates him as a murder suspect." 2 weeks passed with no new developments of the 2 weeks passed with no new developments in the invisible death case, except for the arrival of a letter demanding $1 million and threatening the life of Perkins Ferguson if the demand was ignored. Take note, that's $1 million in 1920s money, so that's like practically $1 billion now, given that 100,000 is like $1 million now. So like there's a whole order of magnitude there. It was ignored and only served to spur Lee and his detectives on to decisive action. They decided to rush to Jouret house and kidnap Jouret with the idea of holding him until he agreed to explain the presence of the number 9 shoes buried at the back of his house. Good luck tying up a magician, though. A low moon hung over the poplars when Lees rang the Jouret front door bell. One detective was guarding a side door and the other a back door. Suddenly, Jouret was seen to jump from a second-story window. As he did, a car driven by one of his Puerto Ricans. That's weird, they spelled it weird. As he did, a car driven by one of his Puerto Ricans came along the drive and he leapt into it. Lees, first to see Jouret, called his detectives, and they came running. Their car was waiting in the road. The Puerto Rican was seen to jump from the Jouret car just as it started south towards New York. Lee took up the race. Both cars had plenty of power, but the Jouret car suddenly disappeared as a low humming noise began to break the stillness of the night. One of the detectives was at the wheel. Lees, as usual, was giving orders. "Keep close to that hum. Never mind, you can't see the car. It's there all right. If you can gain on it enough, drive right into it." "Right-o!" shouted the detective. "We're wise to him now." The humming noise was taking on speed with every second, and so was Lee's car. Soon, Lee's car was making 60 miles an hour with the hum just ahead and barely audible. Past traffic lights, over bridges and grade crossings, the mad chase of the Phantom continued. Wildly racing through the night, missing other cars by a breath, the big visible auto continued its pursuit of... What? Careening, Lee's car rounded a curve, and above the hum just ahead, they heard the shouted curses of their quarry, but he couldn't be seen. Lees could only see the road marked by his lights. Mile after mile, the wild, uncanny chase of the Phantom continued. Soon the lights of New York could be seen in the distance. The cars were forced to slow down somewhat. Suddenly, there was a thundering crash ahead. A car was twisted in a mass of tangled wreckage. Feminine and masculine streaks blended as Lee's car piled up on the wrecked heap. A third car, becoming suddenly visible, rolled over and brought up at the edge of the road. From this car emerged the limping, cursing form of Jouret. From the wreckage, 3 painfully injured young men dragged and tore themselves. Then they leapt, ignoring their pain at the limping figure. The fight was on. Jouret was heavy and powerful and proved an obstinate fighter, for he knew he was fighting for his life. He bit and clawed. He kicked with one uninjured leg and butted with his massive head. Lees and his detectives were fighting with no respect for the rules. Lees managed to get his 2 hands on the bull neck of Jouret, just as one detective connected a duet of blows to the man's wind. Lee's hands closed in a steely grip, and soon Jouret was limp and helpless. They held him there, and an ambulance arrived. A few minutes later, a police auto with reserves came on the scene, and the police shackled Jouret. The car that had been hit by the Phantom was a light sedan. It was occupied by 2 women. Their bodies were drawn from the wreckage, and both were dead. Innocents, sacrificed to the blood madness of a maniac. Jouret was right about himself. He was a paranoiac with a strongly developed homicidal mania. In the wreckage was also found a package containing $200,000 and 2 twisted and broken mechanisms. One was about the size of an ordinary kitchen coffee mill, and the other slightly larger. Regarding these machines, Lees wrote in a report, While making a fourth search of Darrow's laboratory, I found the equations, specifications, and what I believe to be the full plans for the last invention of the ingenious Darius Darrow. Many of the most astounding inventions and discoveries have resulted from theories which were laughed to scorn at the time they were advanced. Roebling's plans for the Brooklyn Bridge resulted in a meeting of the foremost engineers of the day. All agreed that the plans were built on a false premise. They argued that the bridge would fall of its own weight, and they all had a good laugh. And yet, the bridge still stands. Watching smoke float over a hill from army campfires caused an early French scientist to dream of filling a bag full of smoke and riding with it over the hill. The first balloon was the answer to this dream. James Watt is said to have gotten his idea for a steam engine from watching the lid on a tea kettle dance under steam pressure. When Langley was flying his man-carrying kites, and the Wright brothers dreamed of hitching an engine and a propeller to a giant kite. The aeroplane was the result of these experiments. Darrow got his idea from watching a rapidly revolving wheel. He noticed that the spokes and rim blended into a blurred disc when a certain speed was reached. The entire wheel was practically invisible until under certain lighting conditions, when a higher speed was attained. Darrow went further and reached the conclusion that there was a rate of vibration that would produce invisibility. This was accepted in practically all engineering research plants long before it was perfected by Darrow. Facts are that any rapidly vibrating object becomes more and more difficult to outline as its rate of vibration increases. All that was left for Darrow was to arrive at the exact mathematical time, tone, or rate of vibration producing invisibility, and to construct a vibration-producing machine tuned to produce this condition. His first machine produced the vibrations of invisibility in a field with a 3-foot radius in all directions. That is, it caused every solid object within the atmospheric field to vibrate at the rate, tone, or speed of invisibility. This machine was in no sense rotary. It departed from the original example of a revolving wheel and entered instead into general vibration in a given or measured field. The pulsations or vibrations of an ordinary automobile engine will cause every ounce of metal or solid in the automobile, including the driver, to vibrate at the same rate or momentum. This is a known fact, and it provided the basis for Darrow's experiments. Darrow built 2 machines. The first had a field with a radius of 3 feet on all sides. This was used by the killer in his murders. Jaurès stole this machine first, paving his way for the second robbery. With the first machine in his possession, Jaurès was able to commit the Darrow murder without being seen. He had to have the second and larger machine, however, to make his auto disappear. He stole the larger machine at the time of the Darrow murder, and with it he had his auto vanish, as the gardener testified. Both machines were hopelessly smashed in the wreck, but with Darrow's documents at hand, we might be able to construct another, larger model. A machine built on the proper scale will make a plane or a battleship invisible, and should, as Darrow said, make the war against this country impossible. Digging into Jaurès' history, we found that the Mrs. Jaurès were one-cell triplets. Their mother, Miss Doris Nettleton, was an Englishwoman, a member of Jaurès' troupe, as was the father. The mother died at the birth of the triplets, and the father died a few years later. The company was touring Australia at the time. Jaurès and the father had the birth of only one baby recorded. She was named Doris after the mother. The other girls also used this one name. They now have one name among them until the court gives them individual names. Jaurès would never let but one girl be seen at a time. The reason was that he and the father had planned to use the girls, when grown, to create a surprising stage illusion. In this illusion, one girl was to act as the earthly body, and the other girls as the astral bodies of the same purported individual. The father died and Jaurès retired before he ever got around to staging the illusion, but Jaurès continued the deception, however, because it appealed to his showman's nature. The girls at all times were under the hypnotic control of Jaurès, and of course knew nothing of his crazed intellect or crimes. Upon his arrest, Jaurès released the girls from the spell of years.
The Mrs. Nettleton Saint-Jure was always kind to them and was an ethical showman until his mind gave way. I told the triplets that I might find them employment with our concern, but they prefer to follow in the footsteps of their mother and father and return to the stage. Ferguson, quite his normal self once more, since Farnsworth was recovering slowly, twitted Lise about being in love with one of the triplets. Lise admitted that they were most gorgeous blondes, but insisted he preferred one brunette. Then another thing, added Lise. Any man who falls in love with one of the Nettleton triplets will never be sure just which one he fell in love with. And so, the first issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science draws to a close. Now, I'm trying to decide whether we should move on to the February issue. We've got 30 minutes. Let's just see how long the February issue's first story happens to be. That one's April. Not what I want. You must excuse me, I'm digging through my reading device. June, May, March, November, September, October. Where's February? July, January, February. There we are. Old Crompton's Secret by Harl Vincent. So location 55 to 424. Yes, that's only like 8% of the book. We've got time. We've certainly got time. So, now we move on to the February issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science. And we open with the story Old Crompton's Secret by Harl Vincent. 2 miles west of the village of Laketon, there lived an aged recluse who was only known as Old Crompton. As far back as the villagers could remember, he'd visited the town regularly, twice a month, with each time tottering his lonely way homeward with a load of provisions. He appeared to be well supplied with funds, but purchased sparingly, as became a miserly hermit. And so vicious was his tongue that few cared to converse with him, even the young hoodlums of the town hesitating to harass him with a banner usually accorded the other bizarre characters of the streets. The oldest inhabitants knew nothing of his past history, and they had since long lost their curiosity in the matter. He was a fixture, as the old town hall was with its surrounding park. His lonely cabin was shunned by all who chanced to pass along the old dirt road that led through the woods to nowhere and was rarely used. His only extravagance was in the matter of books, and the village bookstore profited considerably by his purchases. But, at the instigation of Crass Harmon, the bookseller, it was whispered about that old Crompton was a believer in the black art, that he'd made a pact with the devil himself, and was leagued with him and his imps. For the books he bought were strange ones, ancient volumes that Cass must needs order from New York or Chicago, and that cost as much as $10 and $15 a copy. Translations of the writings of alchemists and astrologers, and philosophers of dark ages. It was no wonder that old Crompton was looked at askance by the simple living and deeply religious natives of the small Pennsylvania town. But there came a day when the hermit was to have a neighbor, and the town buzzed with excited speculation as to what would happen. The property across the road from Old Crompton's hut belonged to Alton Forsyth, Leakton's wealthiest resident. Hundreds of acres of scrubby woodland that could be considered hundreds of acres of scrubby woodland that he considered well-nigh worthless. But Tom Forsyth, the only son, had returned from college, and his ambitions were of a nature strange to his townspeople and utterly incomprehensible to his father. Something vague about biology and chemical experiments and the like is what he spoke of, and when his parents objected on the grounds of possible explosions and other weird accidents, he prevailed upon his father to have a secluded laboratory built for him in the woods. When the workmen started the small frame structure not a quarter of a mile from his own hut, old Crompton was furious. He raged and stormed, but to no avail. Tom Forsyth had his heart set on the project, and he was somewhat of a successful debater himself. The fire that flashed from his cold gray eyes matched that from the pale blue ones of the elderly anchorite, and the law was on his side. So the building was completed, and Tom Forsyth moved in, bag and baggage. For more than a year, the hermit studiously avoided his neighbor, though, truth to tell, this required very little effort. For Tom Forsyth became almost as much of a recluse as his predecessor, remaining indoors for days at a time and visiting the home of the people scarcely oftener than old Crompton visited the village. He too became the target of village gossip, and his name was ere long linked with that of the old man in similar animadversion. Animadversion? Did you mean to say animadversion? Animadversion, criticism or censure, so it does actually mean that. But he cared naught for the opinions of the townspeople, nor for the dark looks of suspicion that greeted him on his rare appearances in the public eye. His chosen work engrossed him so deeply that all else counted for nothing. His parents remonstrated with him in vain. Tom laughed away their recriminations and fears, continuing with his labors more strenuously than ever. He never troubled his mind over the nearness of old Crompton's hut, the existence of which he hardly considered or noticed. It so happened one day that the old man's curiosity got the better of him, and Tom caught him prowling about on his property, peeking wonderingly at the many rabbit hutches, chicken coops, dovecotes, and the like which cluttered the space to the rear of the laboratory. Seeing that he was discovered, the old man wrinkled his face into a toothless grin of conciliation.
Just looking over your place, Forsyth, he said. Sorry about the fuss I made when you built the house, but I'm an old man, you know, and changes are unwelcome. Now I've forgotten my objections, and I would like to be friends. Could we?
Tom peered searchingly into the flinty eyes that were set so deeply in the wrinkled, leathery countenance. He suspected an ulterior motive, but couldn't find it within him to turn the old fellow down. Why, I guess so, Crompton, he hesitated. I've nothing against you, but I came here for seclusion, and I'll have not anyone bothering me at work. I'll not bother you, young man, but I'm fond of pets, and I see you have many of them here. Guinea pigs, chickens, pigeons, rabbits. Would you mind if I made friends with some of them? Well, they're not pets, answered Tom dryly. They're material for use in my experiments, but amuse yourself with them if you wish. You mean that you cut them up? Kill them, perhaps? Oh, no, not that. Sometimes I change them in physical form. Sometimes cause them to become of huge size. Sometimes produce pygmy offspring of normal animals. Don't they suffer? Very seldom, though occasionally a subject dies. The benefit that will accrue to mankind is well worth the inconvenience to the creatures and their infrequent loss of their insignificant lives. Old Crompton regarded him dubiously. You're trying to find? The secret of life! Tom Forsyth's eyes took on the stare of fanaticism. Before I'm finished, I'll know the nature of the vital force, how to produce it. I'll prolong a human life indefinitely, create artificial life, and the solution is more closely approached with each passing day. The hermit blinked in pretended mystification, but he understood perfectly and bitterly envied the young man's knowledge and ability that enabled him to delve into the mysteries of nature, which had always been so attractive to his own mind. And somehow, he acquired a sudden deep hatred of the coolly confident young man who spoke so positively of accomplishing the impossible. During the winter months that followed, the strange acquaintance progressed but little. Tom didn't invite his neighbor to visit him, nor did old Crompton go out of his way to impose his presence on the younger man, though they each spoke pleasantly enough to each other on the few occasions when they happened to meet. With the coming of spring, they encountered one another more frequently, and Tom found considerable interest in the quaint, borrowed philosophy of the gloomy old man. Old Crompton, of course, was desperately interested in the things that were hidden in Tom's laboratory, but he never requested permission to see them. He hid his real feelings extremely well, and was apparently content to spend as much time as possible with the feathered and furred subjects for experiment, being very careful not to incur Tom's displeasure by displaying too great of an interest in the laboratory itself. Then there came a day in early summer when an accident served to draw the two men closer together, and Old Crompton's long-sought opportunity followed. He was starting for the village when, from down the road, there came a series of tremendous squawkings, and then a bellow of dismay in the voice of his young neighbor. He turned quickly and was astonished at the sight of a monstrous rooster, which had escaped and was headed straight for him with his head down and wings fluttering wildly. Tom followed close behind, but was unable to catch the darting monster. And monster it was, for this rooster stood no less than 3 feet in height and appeared more ferocious than a large turkey. Old Crompton had his shopping bag, a large one of burlap which he always carried to town, and summoned enough courage to throw it over the head of the screeching, oversized fowl. So tangled did the panic-stricken bird become that it was comparatively simple matter to effect his capture, and the old man rose to his feet triumphant, with the bag securely closed over the struggling captive. "Thanks," panted Tom, when he drew alongside. I should never have caught him, and his appearance at large might have caused me a great deal of trouble, now of all times." "It's all right, Forsyth," smirked the old man. "I'm glad I was able to do it." Secretly he gloated, for he knew this occurrence would be an open sesame to that laboratory of Tom's, and it proved to be just that. A few nights later he was awakened by a vigorous thumping at his door, something that had never before occurred during his nearly 60 years' occupancy of the tumble-down hut. The moon was high, and he cautiously peeped from the window and saw that his late visitor was none other than young Forsyth. "With you in a minute," he shouted, hastily thrusting his rheumatic old limbs into shabby trousers. Now to see the inside of that laboratory," he chuckled to himself. It required but a moment to attire himself in the scanty raiment he wore during the warm months, but he could hear Tom muttering and impatiently pacing the flagstones before his door. "What is it?" he asked as he drew the bolt and emerged into the brilliant light of the moon. "Success! I've produced growing living matter synthetically. More than this, I've learned the secret of the vital force, the spark of life. Immortality is within easy reach. Come and see for yourself." They quickly traversed the short distance to the 2-story building which comprised Tom's workshop and living quarters. The entire ground floor was taken up by the laboratory, and Old Crompton stared aghast at the wealth of equipment it contained. Furnaces there were, and retorts that reminded him of those pictured in the woodcuts in some of his musty books. There were complicated machines with many levers and dials mounted on their faces, and with huge glass bulbs of peculiar shape with coils of wire connecting to knob-like protuberances of their transparent walls. In the exact center of the great room, there was what appeared to be a dissecting table with a brilliant light overhead and with 2 of the odd glass bulbs at either end. It was to this table that Tom led the excited old man. "This is my perfected apparatus," said Tom proudly, "and by its use I intend to create a new race of supermen, men and women who will always maintain the vigor and strength of their youth, and who cannot die excepting by actual destruction of their bodies, but under the influence of the rays, all bodily ailments vanish as if by magic, and organic defects are quickly corrected. Watch this now." He stepped to one of the many cages at the side of the room and returned with a wriggling cottontail in his hands. Old Crompton watched anxiously as he picked a nickel instrument from a tray of surgical appliances and requested his visitor to hold the protesting animal while he covered its head with a handkerchief. "Ethyl chloride," explained Tom, noting with the amusement the look of distaste on the old man's face. "We'll just put him to sleep for a minute while I amputate a leg." The struggles of the rabbit quickly ceased when the spray soaked the handkerchief and the anesthetic took effect. With a shining scalpel and a surgical saw, Tom speedily removed one of the 4 legs of the animal, and he placed the limped body in the center of the table, removing the handkerchief from its head as he did so. At the end of the table, there was a panel with a glittering array of switches and electrical instruments, and Old Crompton observed very closely the manipulations of the controls as Tom started the mechanism. With the ensuing hum of a motor generator from the corner of the room, the 4 bulbs adjacent to the table sprang into life, each glowing with a different color and each emitting a different vibratory note as it responded to the energy within. "Now keep an eye on Mr. Rabbit," admonished Tom. From the body of the small animal, there emanated an intangible, though hazy, visible aura. As the combined effect of the rays grew in intensity, Old Crompton bent over the table and peered amazedly at the stump of the foreleg from which blood no longer dripped. The stump was healing over. Yes, it seemed to elongate as one watched. A new limb was growing on to replace the old. Then the animal struggled once more, this time to regain consciousness. In a moment it was fully awake, and with a frightened hop, it was fully off the table and hobbling about in search of a hiding place. Tom Forsyth laughed. "Never knew what happened," he exulted. "And excepting for the temporary limp, it's not inconvenienced at all. Even that limp will be gone in a few hours, for the new limb will be completely grown by that time." But, Tom, this is wonderful. How did you accomplish it?" "Don't think I'll reveal my secret. But this much I'll tell you. The life force generated by my apparatus stimulates a certain gland that's normally inactive in warm-blooded animals. This gland, when active, possesses the function of growing new members to the body to replace lost ones, in much the same manner that's done in the case of the lobster and other crustaceans. Of course, the process is extremely rapid when the gland is stimulated by the vital rays from my tubes, but this is only one of the many wonders in process. Here's something far more remarkable." He took from a large glass jar the body of a guinea pig, a body that was rigid in its death. "This guinea pig was suffocated 24 hours ago and is stone dead." "Suffocated?" Yes, but quite painlessly, I assure you. I simply removed the air from the jar with a vacuum pump, and the little creature passed out of the picture very quickly. Now, here's the fun part. We'll revive it." Old Crompton stretched forth a skinny hand to touch the dead animal, but withdrew it hastily when he felt the clammy rigidity of the body. There was no doubt as to the lifelessness of this specimen. Tom placed the dead guinea pig on the spot where the rabbit had been subjected to the action of the rays. Again his visitor watched carefully as he manipulated the controls of his apparatus. With the glow of the tubes and the ensuing haze of eerie light that surrounded the little body, a marked change was apparent. The inanimate form relaxed suddenly, and it seemed that the muscles pulsated with an accession of energy. Then one leg stretched forth spasmodically. There was a convulsive heave as the lungs drew in the first long breath, and with that, an astonished and very much alive rodent scrambled to its feet, blinking wondering eyes in the dazzling light. "See! See!" shouted Tom, grasping Old Crompton by the arm in a vice-like grip. "It's the secret of life and death! Aristocrats, plutocrats, and beggars will beat a path to my door. But never fear, I'll choose my subjects well. The name of Thomas Forsyth will yet be emblazoned in the Hall of Fame. I shall be the master of the world!" Old Crompton began to fear the glitter in the eyes of the gaunt young man, who seemed suddenly to have become demented, and his envy and hatred of his talented host blazed anew as Forsyth gloried in the success of his efforts. Then he was struck with an idea, and he affected the most ingratiating manner. "It's a marvelous thing, Tom, and it's entirely beyond my poor comprehension. But I can see that it is all that you say and more. Tell me, can you restore the youth of an aged person by these means?" "Oh, positively." Tom didn't catch the eager note in the old man's voice. Rather, he took the question as an inquiry into the further marvels of his process. Here, he continued enthusiastically. "I'll prove to you that also. My dog Spot's around the place somewhere. He's a decrepit old hound, blind, lame, and toothless. You've probably seen him with me." He rushed to the stairs and whistled. There was an answering yelp from above and the pad of uncertain paws on the bare wooden steps. A dejected old beagle wandered into the room, dragging a crippled hind leg as he fawned upon his master, who stretched forth a hand to pat the unsteady head. "Well, I guess Spot's old enough for the test," laughed Tom. "I've been meaning to restore him to youth and vigor anyway. No time like the present." He led his trembling pet to the table of remarkable tubes and lifted him to its surface. The poor old beast lay trustingly where he was placed, quiet save for his husky, asthmatic breathing. "Crompton, if you could hold him," directed Tom as he pulled the starting lever of his apparatus. And old Crompton watched in fascinated anticipation as the urethral luminosity bathed the dog's body in response to the action of the 4 rays. Somewhat vaguely, it came to him that it looked like the baggy flesh of his own wrinkled hand took on a new firmness and color where they reposed on the animal's back. Young Forsyth grinned triumphantly as Spot's breathing became more regular and the rasp gradually left it. Then the dog whined and wagged his tail with increasing vigor. Suddenly he raised his head, perked his ears in astonishment, and saw his master straight in the face with the eyes that saw once more. The low throat cry rose to a full and joyous bark. He sprang to his feet under the restraining hands and jumped to the floor in a lithe muscled leap that carried him halfway across the room. He capered about with the abandon of a puppy, making extremely active use of 4 sound limbs. Why, Forsyth, it's absolutely incredible. Tell me, what is this remarkable force?" His host laughed gleefully. "Well, you probably wouldn't understand it anyway, but I'll tell you. It's simple as the nose on your face. The spark of life, the vital force. It's merely an extremely complicated electrical manifestation, which I've been able to duplicate artificially, with a great deal of work, mind you, but still. This spark of force is all what distinguishes living from inanimate matter, and in living beings, the force gradually decreases in power as the years pass, causing loss of health and strength. The chemical composition of bones and tissue alters. Joints become stiff, muscles atrophied, bones brittle. By recharging, as it were, with the vital force, the gland action is intensified and youth and strength is renewed. By repeating the process every 10 or 15 years, the same degree of vigor can be maintained indefinitely. Mankind could become immortal. That's why I say I'm going to be the master of the world." For the moment, old Crompton forgot his jealous hatred in the enthusiasm with which he was imbued. Tom, he pleaded in his excitement, "use me as a subject. Renew my youth. My life has been a sad one and a lonely one, but I would that I might live it over. I should make of it a far different one, something worthwhile. See, I am ready." He sat down on the edge of the gleaming table and made as if to lie down on its gleaming surface. But his young host only stared at him in open amusement. "What, you?" he sneered unfeelingly. "Why, you old fossil! I told you I'd choose my subjects carefully. They're to be people of standing and wealth, who can contribute to the fame and fortune of one Thomas Forsyth." "But, Tom, I have money," old Crompton begged. But when he saw the hard mirth in the younger man's eyes, his old animosity flamed anew, and he sprang from his position and shook a skinny forefinger in Tom's face. "Don't you do that to me, you old fool, and get out of here. Think I'd waste current on an old cadger like you? Guess not. Now get out. Get out, I say." Then the old anchorite saw red. Something seemed to snap in his soured old brain. He found himself kicking and biting and punching at his host, who backed away from a furious onslaught in surprise. Then Tom tripped over a wire and fell to the floor with a force that rattled the windows, his ferocious little adversary on top. The younger man lay still where he'd fallen, and a trickle of blood showed at his temple. "My God, I've killed him," gasped the old man. With trembling fingers, he opened Tom's shirt and listened for a heartbeat. Panic-stricken, he rubbed the young man's wrists, slapped his cheeks, and ran for water to dash in his face. But all efforts to revive him proved futile, and then, in awful fear, old Crompton dashed into the night, the dog Spot nipping at his heels as he ran. Hours later, the stooped figure of a shabby old man might have been seen stealthily re-entering the lonely workshop where the lights still burned brightly. Tom Forsyth lay rigid in the position which old Crompton has left him, and the dog growled menacingly. Averting his gaze and circling wide of the body, old Crompton made for the table of the marvelous rays. In minute detail, he recalled every move made by Tom and adjusting the apparatus to produce the incredible results he had witnessed. Not a moment was to be wasted now. Already he had hesitated too long, for soon would come the dawn and probable discovery of his crime. But the invention of his victim would save him from the long arm of the law, for, with youth restored, old Crompton would cease to exist and a new life would open its doors to the starved soul of the hermit. Or you could just, heal yourself and then bring him back to not have to worry about it. Hermit indeed. He'd begin life anew, an active man with youthful vigor and ambition. Under an assumed name, he would travel abroad, would enjoy life, and would later become a successful man of affairs. He had enough money, he told himself, and the police would never find old Crompton, the murderer of Tom Forsyth. He deposited his small traveling bag on the floor and fingered the controls of Tom's apparatus. He threw the starting switch confidently and grinned in satisfaction as the answering whine of the motor generator came to his ears. One by one, he carefully made the adjustments in exactly the manner followed by the now silenced discoverer of the process. Everything operated precisely as it had during the preceding experiments. Odd that he should have anticipated some such necessity. But something had told him to observe Tom's movements carefully, and now he rejoiced in the fact that his intuition had led him right. Painfully, he climbed to the tabletop and stretched his aching body in the warm light of the 4 huge tubes. His exertions during the struggle with Tom were beginning to tell on him, but the soreness and stiffness of feeble muscles and stubborn joints would soon be but a memory. His pulses quickened at the thought, and he breathed deep in a sudden feeling of unaccustomed well-being. The dog growled continuously from his position at the head of his master, but didn't move to interfere with the intruder. And old Crompton, in the excitement of the momentous experience, paid him not the slightest attention. His body tingled from head to foot with a not unpleasant sensation that conveyed the assurance of radical changes taking place under the influence of the vital rays. The tingling sensation increased in intensity until it seemed that every corpuscle in his veins danced to the tune of the vibration from those glowing tubes that bathed him in an ever-spreading radiance. Aches and pains vanished from his body, but he soon experienced a sharp stab of new pain in his lower jaw. With an experimental forefinger, he rubbed the gum. He laughed aloud as the realization came to him that in those gums where there had been no teeth for more than 20 years, there was now growing a completely new set. And the rapidity of the process amazed him beyond measure. The aching area spread quickly and was becoming really uncomfortable. But then, and he consoled himself with the thought, nothing is wrought into being without a certain amount of pain. Besides, he was confident that his discomfort would soon be over. He examined his hand and found that the joints of 2 fingers, long crippled with rheumatism, now moved freely and painlessly. The misty brilliance surrounding his body was paling, and he saw that the flesh was taking on a faint green fluorescence instead. The rays had completed their work, and soon the transformation would be fully effected. He turned on his side and slipped to the floor with the agility of a youngster. The dog snarled anew, but kept steadfastly to his position. There was a small mirror over the washstand at the far end of the room, and old Crompton made haste to obtain the first view of his reflected image. His step was firm and springy, his bearing confident, and he found that his long stooped shoulders straightened naturally and easily. He felt that he had taken on at least 2 inches in stature, which was indeed the case. When he reached the mirror, he peered anxiously into its dingy surface, and what he saw there so startled him that he stepped backward in amazement. This was not Larry Crompton, but an entirely new man. The shaggy white hair had given way to soft, healthy waves of chestnut hue. Gone were the seams from the leathery countenance, and the eyes looked out clearly and steadily from under brows as thick and dark as they had been in his youth. The reflected features were those of an entire stranger. They weren't even reminiscent of the Larry Crompton of 50 years ago, but were the features of a far more vigorous and prepossessing individual than he'd ever seemed, even in the best years of his life. The jaw was firm, his once sunken cheeks so well filled out that his high cheekbones were no longer in evidence. It was the face of a man of not more than 38 years of age, reflecting exceptional intelligence and strength of character. What a disguise! He exclaimed in delight, and his voice, echoing in the stillness that followed the switching off of the apparatus, was deep-throated and mellow.
What a disguise!
The voice of a new man. Now, serenely confident that discovery was impossible, he picked up his small but heavy bag and started for the door. Dawn was breaking, and he wished to put as many miles between himself and Tom's laboratory as could be covered in the next few hours.
Okay, but why don't you just, revive him? He literally revived a dead hamster. Just bring the dude back to life. You have no problems. Yes, he's very angry at you, but also, just bring the dude back to life. Really simple.
Anyway, but at the door he hesitated, and then despite the furious yapping of Spot, he returned to the table of rays and with deliberate thoroughness smashed the costly tubes which had been brought about as rehabilitation. With a pinch bar from the nearby tool rack, he wrecked the controls and generating mechanisms beyond recognition. Now he was absolutely sure no meddling experts could possibly discover the secret of Tom's invention. All evidence would show that the young experimenter had met his deaths at the hands of old Crompton, the despised hermit of West Laketon. But none would dream that the handsome man of means, who was henceforth to be known as George Voigt, was that same despised hermit. He recovered his satchel and left the scene. With long, rapid strides, he proceeded down the old dirt road toward the main highway where, instead of turning east into the village, he would turn west and walk to Kensburg, the neighboring town. There, in not more than 2 hours' time, his new life would really begin. Had you, a visitor, departed from Old Laketon when old Crompton died and returned 12 years later? Had you as a visitor departed from Laketon when old Crompton did and returned 12 years later, you would have noticed very little difference in the appearance of the village. The old town hall and little park were the same, the dingy brick building among the trees being just a little dingier and its wooden steps more worn and sagged. The main street showed evidence of recent repaving, and in consequence of the resulting increase automobile traffic, there were 2 new gasoline filling stations in the heart of town. Down the road about a half mile, there was a new building which, upon inquiring from one of the natives, would be proudly designated as the new high school building. Otherwise, there were no changes to be observed, however. In his dilapidated chair on the untidy office that he'd occupied for nearly 30 years sat Asa Culkin, popularly known as Judge Culkin. Justice of the Peace, sheriff, attorney at law, and 3 times mayor of Laketon, he was still a controlling factor in local politics and government. And many a knotty legal problem was settled in that gloomy little office. Many a dispute in the town council was dependent for arbitration upon the keen mind and understanding wit of the old judge. The 4 o'clock train had just puffed its labored way from the station when a stranger entered his office, a stranger of uncommonly prosperous air. The keen blue eyes of the old attorney appraised him instantly and classified him as a successful man of business, not yet 40 years of age, and with a weighty problem on his mind. "What can I do for you, sir?" he asked, removing his feet from the battered desktop.
You may be able to help me a great deal, Judge, came the unexpected reply. I came to Laketon to give myself up.
Give yourself up? Culkin rose to his feet in surprise and unconsciously straightened his shoulders in an effort to seem less dwarfed before the tall stranger. Why, what do you mean?
I wish to give myself up for murder,
answered the amazing visitor, slowly and with decision.
For a murder committed 12 years ago. I should like you to listen to my story first, though. It's been kept too long.
But I still don't understand. There was puzzlement in the old face of the attorney. He shook his gray locks in uncertainty. Why should you come here? Why come to me? What possible interest can I have in the matter?
Just this, Judge. You don't recognize me now, and you'll probably consider my story incredible when you hear it. But when I've given you all the evidence, you'll know I am who I am, and will be compelled to believe. The murder was committed in Laketon. That's why I came to you.
A murder in Laketon? 12 years ago? Again, the aged attorney shook his head. But proceed.
Yes, I killed Thomas Forsyth.
The stranger looked for an expression of horror in the features of his listener, but there was none. Instead, the benign countenance took on the look of deepening amazement, but the smile wrinkles had somehow vanished, and the old face was grave in its surprised interest.
You seem astonished, continued the stranger. Undoubtedly, you were convinced that the murderer was Larry Crompton, old Crompton the hermit. He disappeared the night of the crime and has never been heard from since, am I correct?
Well, yes, he disappeared all right. But continue. Not by a lift of his eyebrow did Culkin betray his disbelief, but the stranger sensed that his story was somehow not as startling as it should have been.
You may think I'm crazy, I presume, but I am old Crompton. It was my hand that felled the unfortunate young man in his laboratory out there in West Laketon 12 years ago tonight. It was his marvelous invention that transformed the old hermit into the apparently young man you see before you. But I swear that I am none other than Larry Crompton and that I killed young Forsyth. I'm ready to pay the penalty. I can bear the flagellation of my own conscience no longer.
The visitor's voice had risen to the point of hysteria, but the listener remained calm and unmoved. Now let me just get this straight. Do I understand that you claim to be old Crompton, rejuvenated in some mysterious manner, and that you killed Tom Forsyth on that night 12 years ago? Do I understand that you wish to go to trial for that crime, pay the penalty now?
Yes, and the sooner the better. I can stand it no longer. I'm the most miserable man in the world.
This is strange, he spoke soothingly to his visitor. Do not upset yourself, I beg you. I'll take care of this for you, you never fear. Just take a sit, Mr.
You may call me Voight for the present,
said the stranger in a more composed tone of voice.
George Voight. That's the name I've been using since that fatal night.
Very well, Mr. Voight, replied the counselor with an air of the greatest solicitude. Please, have a seat now, while I make myself a telephone call. And George Voight slipped into a stiff-backed chair with a sigh of relief, for he knew the judge from the old days and was now certain that his case would be disposed of very quickly. With the telephone number pressed to his ear, Culkin repeated a number. The stranger listened intently during the ensuing silence. Then there came a muffled, "Hello?" sounding an impatient response to the call. "Hello, Alton," spoke the attorney. "This is Asa speaking. A stranger's just dropped into my office, claims to be old Crompton. Remember the hermit across the road from your son's old laboratory? Well, this man, who bears no resemblance whatsoever to the old man he claims to be, who seems to be less than half the age of Tom's old neighbor, says he killed Tom on that night we remember." There were some surprised remarks from the other end of the wire, but Voight couldn't catch them. He was in a cold perspiration at the thought of meeting his victim's father. "Why, yes, Alton, I think there is something in this story, although I can't believe every part of it. But I wish you'd accompany us and visit the lab, will you?"
Lord, man, not that,
interrupted the judge visitor.
I can hardly bear to visit the scene of my crime and in the company of Alison Forsyth. Please, not that.
Now, you just let me take care of this young man, replied the judge testily. Then once more, speaking to the mouthpiece of his telephone, "All right, Alton, we'll pick you up at your office in 5 minutes." He placed the receiver on its hook and turned again to his visitor. "Please be so kind to do exactly as I request. I want to help you. Well, there's more to this thing than you know, and I want you to follow unquestioningly where I lead. Ask no questions at all for the present, all right? Things may turn out differently than you expect them to."
All right, Judge.
The visitor resigned himself to whatever might transpire under the guidance of the man he had called upon him to turn over to the officers of the law. Seated in the judge's ancient motor car, they stopped at the office of Alton Forsyth a few minutes later and were joined by that red-faced and pompous old man. Few words were spoken during that short run to the well-remembered location of Tom's laboratory, and the man who was known as George Voight caught his own... And the man who was known as George Voight caught at his own throat with nervous fingers when they passed the tumble-down remains of the hut in which old Crompton had spent so many years. With a screeching of well-worn brakes, the car stopped before the laboratory, which was now almost hidden behind a mass of shrubs and flowers. Easy now, young man, cautioned the judge, noting the look of fear which had clouded his new client's features. The three men advanced to the door through which old Crompton had fled on that night of horror 12 years before. The elder Forsyth spoke not a word as he turned the knob and stepped within. Voight shrank from entering, but soon enough mastered his feelings and followed the other two. The sight that met his eyes caused him to cry aloud in awe. At the dissecting table, which seemed to be exactly as he had seen it last, but with replicas of the tubes he had destroyed once more in place, stood Tom Forsyth. Considerably older and with hair prematurely gray, he was still the young man Crompton thought he'd killed. Tom Forsyth wasn't dead after all, and after all his years of misery had gone for nothing. He advanced slowly to the side of the wondering young man, Alton Forsyth and Asa Culkin watching silently from just inside the door.
Tom,
Spoke the stranger.
you're alive? You weren't dead when I left you on that terrible night when I smashed your precious tubes. Oh, it's too good to be true. I can scarcely believe my eyes.
He stretched forth trembling fingers to touch the body of the young man to assure himself that it was not a dream. Why, said Tom Forsyth in astonishment. I don't know you, sir. I've never seen you in my life. What do you mean by your talk of smashing my tubes, of leaving me for dead?
Mean?
The stranger's voice rose now. He was growing excited.
Why, Tom, I am old Crompton. Remember the struggle here in this very room? You refused to rejuvenate an unhappy old man with your marvelous apparatus in a temporarily insane old man. Crompton, I was that old man. I fought with you. You fell, striking your head. There was blood. You were unconscious. For many hours I was sure that you were dead and I murdered you. But I watched your manipulations of the apparatus. I subjected myself to the action of the rays. My youth was miraculously restored. I became as you see me now. Detection was impossible, for I didn't really look like old Crompton, no more than you do. I smashed your machinery to avoid suspicion. Then I escaped, and for 12 years I thought myself a murderer. I suffered the tortures of the damned.
Tom Forsyth advanced on this remarkable visitor with clenched fists. Staring him in the eyes with a cold appraisal, his wrath was all too apparent. The dog Spot, young as ever, entered the room and upon observing the stranger, set up an ominous growling and snarling. At least the dog recognized him. What are you trying to do? Catechize me? Are you another one of those alienists my father has been bringing around? The young inventor was furious. If you are, you can get out of here now. I'll have no more of this meddling with my affairs. I'm as sane as any of you, and I refuse to submit to this continual persecution. The elder Forsyth grunted, and Culkin laid a restraining hand on his arm. Just a minute now, Tom, he said soothingly. This stranger's no alienist. He's got a story to tell. Please, permit him to finish. Somewhat mollified, Tom Forsyth shrugged his assent.
Tom, what I've said is the truth. I shall prove it to you. I'll tell you two things that no mortal on earth could know but we two. Remember the day I captured the big rooster for you, the monster you'd created? Remember the night you awakened me, brought me here in the moonlight? The rabbit whose leg you amputated and regrew? The poor guinea pig you suffocated and the life you restored? Spot here, don't you remember rejuvenating him? I was here. And you refused to use your process on me, old man that I was. This is when I went mad and attacked you. Do you believe me, Tom?
Then a strange thing happened. While Tom Forsyth sagged in growing belief, the stranger's shoulders sagged and he trembled as with the ague. The two older men who had kept in the background gasped their astonishment as his hair faded to a sickly gray, then became as white as the driven snow. Old Crompton was reverting to his previous state. Within 5 minutes, instead of the handsome young stranger, there before them stood a bent, withered old man, old Crompton, without a doubt. The effects of Tom's process were spent.
Well, I'll be damned,
ejaculated Alton Forsyth. "You've been all right all along, Isa, and I'm mighty glad I didn't commit Tom as I intended. He told us the truth all these years. We were not wise enough to see it." "We?" exclaimed the judge. "You, Alton Forsyth, you always upheld him. You'd done your son a grave injustice, and you owe him your apologies if if ever father owed his son anything." "You're right, Isa." And his aristocratic pride forgotten, Alton Forsyth rushed to the side of his son and embraced him. The judge turned to old Crompton pityingly. "Rather a bad ending for you, Crompton. Still, it's better by far than being branded as a murderer." "Better? Better? Ha! It's wonderful, Judge. I've never been so happy in my life." The face of the old man beamed through scalding tears coursed down the withered and seamed cheeks. The two Forsyths looked up from their demonstrations of peacemaking to listen to the amazing words of the old hermit.
"Yes, happy for the first time in my life," he continued. "I'm 100 years of age, gentlemen, and I look and feel it. That is how it should be, and my experience has taught me a final lasting lesson. None of you know it, but when I was a very young man, I was bitterly disappointed in love. Never think it to look at me now, would you? But I was, and it ruined my entire life. I had a little money inherited, and I traveled the world for a few years, and then settled in that old hut across the road where I buried myself for 60 years, becoming crabbed and sour and despicable. Young Tom here was the first bright spot, and though I admired him, I hated him for his opportunities. I hated him for that which he had that I had not. With the promise of this invention, I thought I saw new happiness, a new life for myself. And I will say I got what I wanted, though not in the way I expected. I want to tell you, gentlemen, there's nothing in it. With the developments of modern science, you may be able to restore a man's useful vigor of body, but you can't cure his mind with electricity. Though I had a youthful body, my brain was the brain of an old man. Memories were there which could not be suppressed. Even had I not had the fancied death of young Tom on my conscience, I should still have been miserable. I worked, God, how I worked, to forget. But I couldn't forget. I was successful in business and made a lot of money. I am more independent, probably wealthier than you, Alton Forsyth, but that didn't bring me happiness. I longed to be myself once more, to have the aches and pains which had been taken from me. It's natural to age and die. Immortality would make of us a people of relentless, restless misery. We'd quarrel and bicker and long for death, which would not come to relieve us. Now it is over for me, and I am glad.
He paused for breath, looking beseechingly at Tom Forsyth.
Tom, I suppose you have nothing for me in your heart but hatred, and I don't blame you, but I wish you could try and forgive me. Can you?
The years had brought increased understanding and tolerance to young Tom. He stared at old Crompton, and the long-nursed anger over the destruction of his equipment melted into a strange mixture of pity and admiration for the courageous old fellow. "Why, I guess I can, Crompton. There was many a day when I struggled hopelessly to reconstruct my apparatus, cursing you with every bit of energy in my makeup. I could cheerfully have throttled you had you been within reach. For 12 years I've labored incessantly to reproduce the results we had attained on the night of which you speak. People called me insane. Even my father wished to have me committed to an asylum. And until now, I've been unsuccessful. Only today has it seemed for the first time that my experiments will again succeed. But my ideas will have changed with regard to the process of the uses of the process. I was a cocksure young pup in the old days, with foolish dreams of fame and influence. But I've seen the error of my ways. Your experience, too, convinces me that immortality may not be as desirable as I thought. But there are great possibilities in the way of relieving the sufferings of mankind and in making this a better world in which to live. With your advice and help, I believe I can do great things. I forgive you freely, and I ask that you remain here with me to assist in the work that is to come. What do you say to the idea?" At the reverent thankfulness in the pale eyes of the broken old man, who had so recently been a perfect specimen of vigorous youth, Alton Forsyth blew his nose noisily. The little judge smiled benevolently and shook his head as if to say, "I told you so." Tom and Old Crompton gripped hands mightily. And that's that. And so the story of Tom and Old Crompton draws to a close, and that's where our show draws to a close. Next week, we'll be back with more of the February issue of Astounding Stories of Super Science. And the story we're going to be reading next is called Spawn of the Stars by Charles Willard Diffin. Everybody look forward to that. Unfortunately, I'm the last one on the stinger tonight. Apparently, I'm not supposed to leave the board on, but we'll see. Maybe, I don't know if the stinger rebroadcasts another channel or not. We'll find out, but that's all for me, folks. This has been Paper Cuts. If you missed something, you showed up in the middle of the broadcast, go check out the stream VOD tomorrow around noon my time for the full story at Glacier Nestor on YouTube. I hope everyone has a great week.